You come down to the river before the sun has thought about rising, when the world is still a single colour that has no name, because it is not quite grey and not quite blue and not quite anything you could point to in daylight. The path is a soft ribbon of packed earth and sheep cropped grass that you know without needing to look, and your feet find it even though your eyelids still feel heavy, and your breath rises in small clouds that dissolve behind you into the larger cloud of the morning. Over one shoulder you carry the Wicker Eel trap, a long tapering cone of woven willow that is 20 years old and has the colour of dark honey where it is not rubbed pale by river water and handling. Over the other shoulder hangs a small leather bag that holds the tools you will need later, although later still feels far away and unimportant. The trap is light but awkward, and as you walk you feel it sway with your stride, a gentle pendulum that taps against your thigh through the thick wool of your cloak, a rhythm you have walked with every autumn since you were old enough to wade into the Severn and set a line. The air is cool without being cold, the kind of cool that settles on your skin like a second layer of clothing, and it carries the smell of wet earth that has been slowly releasing its breath all night. Somewhere ahead of you, though still invisible, the river is breathing too, a low and constant whisper that you cannot separate from the rustle of the hedgerow on your left, or the occasional soft tumble of a clod of soil from the bank where a watervole has been digging. You pause once on the path, not because you are tired, but because the mist is beginning to lift from the fields in great slow sheets, and it seems disrespectful to walk through something so quiet without stopping to notice it properly. The mist does not swirl or race, it simply hangs, a white-grey blanket that touches the ground and the sky at the same time and makes it impossible to tell where one ends and the other begins. You watch a patch of it detach from the rest and drift across the stubble of last season's hay, moving so slowly that you cannot be sure it is moving at all until you look away, and then look back and see that it has reached a different fence post. After a while you continue walking, and the mist accepts you back into itself without comment. By the time you reach the riverbank, the quality of the darkness has changed. Not lighter exactly, but less dense, as if someone has poured a very small amount of milk into a very large pot of water. The Severn appears first as a sense of open space rather than as a body of water, a feeling that the land has stopped and something else has begun. Then you begin to pick out details, the tops of the reed beds standing upright and still like an army of thin grey spears, the flat expanse of the water itself moving so smoothly that it looks solid, the far bank, which is not really visible but is suggested by the absence of reeds and the presence of a darker smudge that might be trees. You find your usual spot, a small patch of grass that has been flattened over many years by your own boots and, before that, by your father's boots and your grandfather's boots, and you lower the wicker trap carefully to the ground. The grass is damp, and it wets the knees of your breeches as you kneel down, but you do not mind. The dampness is part of the morning, and it will dry eventually, or it will not. The leather bag comes off your shoulder, and you place it beside you on the grass, untying the knot that holds it closed with fingers that are still waking up. Inside, wrapped in a piece of old linen, are the things you always bring: a small iron knife with a handle worn smooth as a pebble, a ball of hemp twine the colour of dried hay, a spare length of thicker cord for the trap line, a flat stone in a leather pouch, and 3 iron needles of different sizes stuck into a scrap of felted wool. You take out the knife first and lay it on the grass, then the twine, then the whetstone pouch, arranging them in a little row from left to right, as you always do, because order is a kind of comfort when you are still half in a dream. The mist has settled into the river valley now, and it sits on the water like a heavy lid, muffling every sound so that even the call of a distant moorhen seems to come from inside a wool-packed box. You sit back on your heels and just look at the river for a while, because there is no rush, and because the river at dawn is a thing that deserves to be looked at without purpose. The water is high for autumn, carrying the memory of rains that fell a week ago up in the hills where the Severn begins as a trickle in a peat bog. You can tell by the colour, a soft brown that is not mud but peat stain, and by the way the current pulls at the stems of the reeds, bending them downstream in a steady, persistent lean. From where you kneel, you can see the surface of the water breaking into small ruffled patches where the current meets an underwater obstacle, a sunken branch or a ridge of clay, and then smoothing out again a little further on. The The sound the river makes is not one sound, but many sounds layered together. A low, deep gurgle that you feel as much as you hear. A higher whisper where the water threads through the reed stems. The occasional soft plop of a fish rising somewhere out in the current, and underneath it all the vast quiet hum of a great volume of water moving towards the sea. You close your eyes for a moment and let the sounds settle over you. When you open them again, the mist has shifted slightly, and you can now see the shape of the far bank, a line of willows and alders whose branches trail in the water like the hair of sleeping giants. You turn your attention to the eel trap. It lies on the grass beside you, a long cone of woven withies about the length of your arm, with your fingers fully extended, and even in this half-light, you can see the places where it needs mending. You lift it onto your lap, feeling the familiar weight and the slight give of the old willow, and you begin your inspection of the wide mouth of the trap, which circles a stout hoop of hazel, wrapped in a spiral of willow bark. The binding is held well through last season, though the bark has darkened with age and repeated soakings, and your thumb finds a spot where the wrapping has begun to fray. A tiny lift of fiber that catches on your skin. You make a quiet mental note, a small tick in the slow inventory you are taking, and let your thumb move on. The weave of the trap's belly is a regular randing that goes over and under each upright stake in a pattern as old as baskets, as old as fishing. You can see where the withies have dried and shrunk over the summer, leaving narrow gaps between the strands that a slim silver eel might wriggle through. And you note these gaps with the same calm attention you would give to counting sheep in a field. Your fingers travel down the length of the trap, tracing each willow strand, feeling for splits or soft spots that might give way under the weight of a catch. About a hand's length back from the mouth you find the first real damage. A withy that has cracked along the grain, probably from being knocked against a stone in the current. Its two halves separated just enough to show the paler wood inside. You press the crack gently with your thumb, and the two sides move apart and then spring back together, a tiny mouth opening and closing without a sound. It will need replacing, you decide, and you turn the trap slightly to see if the damage goes all the way through to the inside, which it does. A little further along you find a second split, this one smaller and running at an angle across another withy, more a surface crack than a breakthrough, though still something that will need attention before the trap goes back into the water. The upright stakes that form the spine of the trap are mostly sound. Good thick hazel rods that you cut yourself 2 winters ago from the coppice behind the church, but one of them feels a little loose where it meets the mouth hoop, and when you wiggle it between your fingers, it moves 1/4 of an inch to the left before the weave catches it. You will need to tighten that binding, perhaps add a fresh wrapping of twine, and the thought files itself away in the quiet cabinet of your mind. The funnel mouth at the narrow end of the trap is the most delicate part, a tight, inward-facing cone of slender willow tips that must point exactly towards the center so that an eel can slide in easily but cannot find its way out again. You bring the trap closer to your face, turning it so that what little light there is falls into the opening, and you peer inside. Most of the tips are still sharp and correctly angled, but 2 of them have bent backwards, probably from the thrashing of a large eel that you remember catching in the last run of the season before the river grew cold. Those 2 tips will need to be cut out and replaced entirely, because bent willow cannot be straightened again without snapping, and you will need to find withies that are long enough and flexible enough to match the others. You lower the trap back onto your lap and sit for a moment, running your fingers over the rough surface, feeling the history of every mend and every replacement in the different shades of the willow, the oldest pieces dark from many soakings and the newer ones still carrying a hint of the green-gold color they had when you first peeled the bark. Around you, the morning is slowly separating its colors. The sky has moved from that nameless knot gray to a pale pearl and then, very gently, to a wash of the softest blue that you can see through the gaps in the mist. The mist itself has begun to thin, pulling apart into long bands that lie across the river like strips of unspun wool, and in the spaces between them you can now see the water's surface clearly, a moving mirror that reflects the sky without any of the sky's brightness. A single duck, a mallard hen by the shape of her, paddles out from the reed bed and crosses the river in a straight line, leaving a V-shaped ripple that widens and fades and then is gone. You watch her until she reaches the far side and disappears into the shadow of the willows, and then you look back at the trap because there is still more to see. The bottom end of the trap, where the withies come together in a tightly bound point, is reinforced with a thick wrapping of tarred twine that you renewed early last spring. You test it now by hooking a finger under the wrapping and pulling gently outward. It holds firm, with no give and no sign of the twine rotting. The tar smell rises faintly, a dark and smoky note that cuts through the clean, wet smell of the river, and it reminds you of the day you stood in the yard, behind the cottage heating the tar over a small fire, dipping the twine into the hot black liquid, and then winding it around the trap while the twine was still warm enough to stick to itself. That was a cold spring day with a wind that kept blowing the smoke into your eyes, and you remember blinking the sting away as you worked. But the memory is distant and without any strong feeling attached to it, just another small piece of the year's turning. You pick up the iron knife now, and use its point to gently probe a few of the intersections in the weave where two withies cross each other. In one place the weave has worn thin from rubbing against the riverbed, and the willow has become flat and shiny as if polished, though the fibers underneath are still strong when you press them. In another place, close to the middle of the trap, a short piece of withy has snapped entirely and now dangles by a single strand of willow fiber, swinging like a tiny pendulum every time you tilt the trap. You cut this piece free with a single careful stroke of the knife and set it aside on the grass, a small brown sliver that will be added to the firewood bundle later. The gap it leaves behind is about the width of 2 fingers, an oblong hole that looks wrong against the neat regular weave, and you already start to think about which of the soaked withies from your bundle will best fit that space. The bundle of new withies is still at home, cut and bound, and waiting in a bucket of river water by the workshop door, and you picture it now with the same unhurried attention you have given the trap. There are perhaps 30 rods in the bundle, ranging from the thickness of your little finger to the thickness of a goose quill, each one selected for its straightness and its lack of knots. You cut them 3 days ago from the osier bed on the far side of the water meadow, working in a light rain that beaded on the willow leaves and dripped onto your neck, and you remember the satisfying snap of each rod parting from its stump. Tomorrow, or perhaps later today, you will walk home and fetch the bundle, carry it back to this spot, and begin the soaking that will make the withies pliable enough to weave. But that is for later. Right now there is no later. There is only the trap on your lap and the river moving past, and the mist thinning into a high clinging haze that has turned the sun into a pale flat disk you can look at directly without squinting. You lift the trap and turn it over, inspecting the side that has been lying against your knees. This side is in better condition, the withies still firm and close-fitting, though you find a smear of dried river slime that has turned to a grey powder, and you rub it off with your thumb, watching the particles drift down onto the grass. A small spider has spun a web across one of the gaps in the weave, a flimsy hammock of silk that trembles with your breath, and you blow gently on it to watch the spider scurry into a crevice before you brush the web away. Everything on this side is as it should be, and you feel a quiet satisfaction that is too mild to be called relief, more like the sense of a job that will be manageable rather than overwhelming. Now you set the trap down on the grass again, parallel to the river, and stretch your arms and back, feeling the stiffness of the walk unknot itself slowly. The grass around you is beaded with dew and it wets your sleeves where you put your hands down, leaving dark patches on the wool. You stand up, because you have been kneeling for a long time without noticing, and you walk the few steps to the edge of the bank where the turf gives way to bare mud and exposed roots. The mud is smooth and dark, and it holds the prints of the birds that came to the water earlier than you, the neat 3-toed prints of a heron, the smaller arrowhead prints of a moorhen, the delicate fans of a wagtail. Your own boots make deep impressions that fill instantly with water, and you watch the water cloud and then clear, cloud and then clear, a tiny cycle that repeats until you stop moving and stand still. The river from this close is a living thing, a skin of moving light over a deep body of shadow. You can see a few inches into the water before the peat stain swallows the view. But even in those few inches there is a world, tiny translucent midge-larvae jerking through the water column. A water snail the size of your smallest fingernail gliding over a submerged stem, the dark green threads of waterweed waving like ribbons in a slow breeze. You bend down and dip your hand into the river, feeling the cold grip your fingers and then release them as your skin adjusts. The water here at the edge is slow, a shallow backwater where leaves gather and spin in lazy circles. And when you lift your hand, the droplets fall from your fingertips in a quicksilver chain and are gone into the hole. You wipe your hand on your breeches and turn back to the trap, which lies on the grass like a sleeping animal, patient and still. The leather bag is where you left it, the tool row undisturbed, and you crouch down again to replace each item inside, wrapping the knife in the linen, tucking the whetstone pouch beside it, coiling the twine into a loose figure 8 so it will not tangle. You pull the bag's cord tight and set it aside, and then you pick up the trap and carry it to the base of a nearby willow where it will be safe and shaded until you return. The willow is old, its trunk a mass of burls and fissures, and it leans out over the water at an angle that has not changed in your lifetime. You prop the trap against the trunk so that its mouth faces upward toward the branches, and you take a moment to run your hand down its full length one last time, as if saying goodbye, or not goodbye, but something closer to see you soon. The night's cold has left the willow slightly stiff to the touch, but the morning air is already warming it, and by the time you come back it will be flexible enough to work. Then you stand for a while doing nothing, because there is nothing that needs doing. The mist has gone entirely now, burned off by a sun that is still low and golden behind the trees on the east bank, and the river has opened out into a wide sheet of pewter light that hurts the eyes only a little and only at the edges. A flock of starlings rises from a distant field, a scattering of black dots that wheel and turn as if moved by a single thought, and then they drop back down into the grass and are gone. You feel the day settle around you, a day that will be given over to small tasks and long waiting, to the feel of wet willow and the sound of the Severn, and you find yourself in no hurry to begin it, because the beginning is already done. The trap waits, the river flows, and the morning holds you in its grey and quiet palm. You leave the riverbank behind, stepping up onto the sheep-cropped turf that rises gently from the mud edge, your boots pressing into the close-woven grass with a softness that makes no sound in the wider quiet of the morning. The turf gives way after a dozen strides to a narrow path that follows the top of the bank for a little way, and then turns inland alongside a hedgerow, and you take this turning without needing to think about it, your feet finding the flat stones that had been pressed into the earth by generations of walkers who came this way for the same purpose you have now. The hedge stands taller than your head, a dense thicket of hawthorn and blackthorn and the occasional elder, all of them grown together so tightly that the boundary between one bush and the next is impossible to see, and as you walk beside it, you feel the cool shade it casts fall across your shoulders like a shawl that someone has laid there quietly. The sky above you is a pale, even grey that has lost the pearl of dawn, a lid of high cloud that lets through the light without showing the sun itself, and it casts no shadows on the ground, only a soft, general illumination that makes every leaf and twig appear washed clean. You walk slowly, slower than your legs would like to go, because the purpose of this walk is not to arrive anywhere quickly, but to look at things, to notice the thickness and colour and flexibility of the young shoots that rise from the hedge and from the coppice beyond, and this noticing cannot be hurried any more than the growth of the shoots themselves could be hurried. The air has warmed a little since you first sat by the river, though your breath still shows faintly when you exhale towards the darker shadows under the hedge, and the smell of damp earth and crushed grass rises around you with every step. You carry the small iron knife in your right hand, its blade folded back into the handle out of habit when walking, and in your left hand you carry a length of hemp twine coiled into a loose loop that hangs from 2 fingers, ready to bind the bundle you will make. A bundle that does not yet exist except as an idea in the quiet cabinet of your mind, alongside the picture of the damaged trap still waiting under the willow. The knife handle is warm from your palm now, the wood polished by so many years of use that it has taken on the color of dark tea, and from time to time you shift it in your grip without thinking, turning it over to feel the small notch near the hinge that your thumb knows as well as your thumb knows the seam of your own cloak. The hedge on your left is full of small movements that have nothing to do with you. A wren flits from a lower branch to a higher one, its tiny body a blur of brown that disappears into the leaves before you can properly focus. A spider's web, hung between 2 hawthorn twigs, trembles with the passing of a midge too small to see. A single yellowing leaf detaches from an elder and drifts down in a slow zigzag that ends in the grass. You notice all these things, and then let them go, because your attention is on the shoots that push up from the base of the hedge, the young rods of willow and hazel and dogwood that will be pliable enough to weave and strong enough to hold their shape once dried. The hawthorn and blackthorn themselves are no good for trap making, their wood too hard and too full of thorns that would tear the skin of an eel as it pushed through, but among them, here and there, you spot the suckers of osier willow that have spread from the coppice further along, and you stop to examine each one. The first osier you find is the thickness of your little finger, and rises straight as a reed from a tangle of bramble. Its bark a smooth green, gold with small horizontal marks where leaves once attached. You bend down and take the rod between your thumb and forefinger, feeling the slight chill of the bark and the firm resistance of the wood beneath. And you bend it gently to test its flexibility. It curves into a smooth U without cracking, the tip nearly touching the base, and then springs back to its original shape when you release it with a tiny shiver that runs all the way down to your hand. A shiver that tells you the wood is alive and full of sap and will weave perfectly after a good soaking. You unfold the knife and make the cut low down, close to the ground where the rod is thickest, slicing at an angle so that rainwater will run off the stump and not rot the root. The knife goes through the soft wood with a sound like a very small sigh, and the rod comes free in your hand. The cut end pale and wet, and smelling faintly of green. You strip the few small leaves and side twigs from the rod with a single downward pull of your fingers, dropping them onto the grass, and then you lay the cleaned rod flat on the path and continue walking. A little further along the hedge, you find a second osier growing close to an elder stump, this one a shade thicker than the first and slightly darker in color, with a faint reddish tinge near the base that tells you it had more sun on it during the summer just past. You test its flexibility as you did the first, bending it into an arc that feels just a little stiffer, but still smooth and unbroken. And as you bend it, you run your thumb along the bark to feel for any hidden knots or cracks that might not be visible to the eye. The bark is smooth all the way, with only the faintest ripple where a leaf bud has swelled, and so you cut it low and strip it and lay it beside the first on the path, the two rods now lying parallel like the beginnings of a small neat map of your intentions. The path leads you past a gap in the hedge where a gate once stood, its posts still embedded in the soil, but its bars long gone, and through the gap you can see the open field that slopes down towards a distant line of pollarded willows, their knotted heads silhouetted against the pale sky. This is the coppice you are aiming for, a damp patch of ground where the osiers grow thickly because the water table is high and the soil never fully dries out, even in late summer. And you leave the hedge path now to cross the field, the grass longer here and wetter, soaking the hem of your breeches and the tops of your boots as you walk. The ground is uneven, tussocky in places where the cattle have grazed and left their heavy prints, and you pick your way slowly, not because it is difficult, but because there is no reason to hurry, and because the motion of walking through long wet grass is pleasant in itself, a kind of slow rhythm that matches the rhythm of your breathing. By the time you reach the coppice, the cloud has thinned a little, and the light has brightened to the color of skimmed milk, still without any direct sun, but clearer than before, and you can see the details of the willow stools with a new clarity. The stools are old, gnarled knuckles of wood that have been cut back every few years for longer than anyone can remember, and from their tops they send up dozens of long, straight shoots that rise like the spines of an umbrella turned inside out. Some of these shoots are 3 years old, and too thick for your purpose, their bark already dark and fissured, while others are this year's growth, slender and shiny, and the color of olive oil, and it is these you have come for. You walk among the stools, stepping over the cut stumps of previous harvests that litter the ground like a giant's game of pickup sticks, and you begin to select the rods one by one, each choice made with the same careful attention you gave to the trap earlier. You find a stool that has put up a particularly fine crop of new shoots, perhaps a dozen rods all rising within a hand's breadth of each other and all straight as plumb lines. You crouch beside it and run your eyes along each rod from base to tip, checking for any that have been damaged by insects or broken by the wind, but they are all sound, smooth, barked and gently tapering, and you feel a quiet satisfaction that is not excitement, but something slower and deeper, the satisfaction of finding exactly what you need in the place you expected to find it. The bark of these rods is a pale green where it faces outward towards the light, and a softer yellow, brown on the inner side where the shoots have rubbed together in the breeze, and when you run your finger along them you feel the slight waxy bloom that young willow carries, a bloom that will disappear after a day in the water. You take the knife and begin to cut, selecting the rods that are between the thickness of a goose quill and the thickness of your thumb, the sizes that will fill the different gaps in the trap's belly and replace the broken withies you found this morning. Each cut is a small, deliberate action. You hold the rod a little way above the base with your left hand, pulling it gently away from the stool so that the knife can reach cleanly, and you make the slice with a single smooth draw, not sawing back and forth, but letting the sharp edge do its work. The sound is a soft snick that is immediately swallowed by the open air, and the rod comes away in your hand with a tiny bead of sap already gathering at the cut end. A clear drop that catches the light for a moment before it spreads and sinks into the wood. You strip the side branches as you did before, working from the thick end to the tip, and you pile the cleaned rods on the grass beside you, turning each one slightly so that the pile stays neat and the rods do not roll away. After you have cut perhaps a dozen rods, the pile is big enough to make a start on the mending, though you will need more than this to finish the whole trap, so you move to another stool a few paces away and repeat the process, selecting, testing, cutting, stripping, and piling. This stool has been grazed by deer, you notice, the tips of several shoots nibbled off in the winter when food was scarce, and the rods that remain are a little shorter than the ones from the first stool, but still perfectly usable for the tighter sections of the weave near the funnel mouth. You cut 6 rods from this stool and add them to the pile, and then you stand up and stretch your back, which has begun to feel the slight stiffness of crouching, and you look around the coppice with the unhurried gaze of someone who has done this many times and will do it many times again. The coppice is very quiet. The only sounds are the distant murmur of the river that you cannot really hear, but can feel as a low hum at the edge of your awareness, and the occasional dry rattle of a reed bunting somewhere in the field behind you, and the soft pad of your own boots on the damp ground. A light breeze has begun to stir, so light that it barely moves the leaves of the willows, but enough to make the tallest shoot sway in a slow circular motion that seems to have no beginning and no end. You feel the breeze on your face, and it is cool without being cold, carrying the same clean smell of wet earth and water that the morning has carried since you first stepped outside. And you stand for a while just feeling it, and letting your eyes rest on the pale sky above the stool tops. When you have rested enough, you gather the cut rods from the grass, picking them up one by one to avoid snapping any of the tips, and you arrange them into a single bundle that you hold against your chest with one arm while you reach for the twine with the other. Bundling is a task that requires a certain amount of patience, because the rods are still springy and want to slide out of alignment. But you have done it so many times that your hands know exactly how to hold them, the thick ends all together, the thin ends fanning out slightly to balance the weight. You loop the twine around the bundle near the thick end first, pulling it tight with a single sharp tug, and tying it in a knot that will hold but can be undone easily with a pull on the loose end, a knot your father taught you when you were still too small to reach the high stools without standing on a log. Then you tie a second loop near the middle of the bundle, where the rods are narrower, and this time you leave a longer tail of twine that you can use as a carrying loop if you want to hang the bundle from a branch later, though for now you simply tuck the tail into the binding and leave it. The bundle is heavier than you expected, or perhaps it is exactly as heavy as you expected, but the weight still surprises you after the lightness of the individual rods, and you lift it with both hands and settle it across your right shoulder, adjusting its position until the weight sits evenly and the twine does not dig into your skin through your cloak. The bundle extends behind you and in front of you like a long, narrow barrel, and as you walk it sways with your steps, a gentle rhythm that is almost the same as the sway of the trap on your shoulder earlier in the morning, except that this bundle is bigger and makes a slight rustling sound as the rods rub against each other, a sound like very distant rain on a thatch roof. You leave the coppice by the same way you came, crossing the tussocky field diagonally, so that you will meet the hedge path at the gap with the old gateposts. The sky has begun to change again, the milk-pale light deepening by the smallest degree into a cooler tone that suggests the morning is moving towards noon, even though the sun is still hidden, and the flatness of the light makes the field seem larger than it really is, stretching away on all sides to hedges that look like dark lines drawn with a ruler. You walk with the bundle on your shoulder and the knife folded in your pocket, and your mind fully occupied with the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other, and for a while there is nothing else in the world except the grass brushing your legs, the weight of the withies, and the steady rhythm of your boots on the soft ground. At the hedge path you turn left and retrace your morning route, passing the place where you cut the first 2 rods from the osier suckers, and you notice with a mild, distant satisfaction that those 2 rods are still lying on the path where you left them, undisturbed, their ends pale and their length as straight as they were when you placed them there. You bend down carefully, keeping the bundle balanced on your shoulder with a practiced tilt, and you pick up the 2 rods with your free hand, adding them to the front of the bundle by tucking their thick ends under the twine loop and letting the tips protrude beyond the others, an untidy addition that you can fix later, but that will hold for the short distance remaining. The path winds a little as it follows the riverbank, dodging the roots of an old ash that has half fallen into the water and steering around a patch of nettles that you know to avoid because you brushed against them once as a boy and remember the sting long after the redness faded. The river appears through the thinning scrub on your right, a grey-brown surface that looks exactly as it looked when you left it, moving at the same pace, carrying the same small flecks of foam and the same drifting leaves, and the familiarity of it settles something in you that you had not noticed was unsettled. You reach the spot where you propped the trap against the willow, and you can see it now, still leaning there with its mouth open to the branches as if it were asking the tree a question, and the sight of it brings back the whole slow inventory of splits and gaps and loose bindings that you will soon begin to mend. You lower the bundle from your shoulder with a careful heave, bending your knees so that the weight comes down gently onto the grass beside the willow, and you let it lie there, the withies still bound and their tips fanning out over the flattened turf. For a moment you just stand and look at the bundle and the trap together, the raw material and the thing to be mended, and the space between them is a space of quiet possibility that you will fill with the work of the next hours, work that does not need thinking about now, because now is for catching your breath, for feeling the ache in your shoulder fade into a faint warmth, and for letting the pale sky hold you in its steady, undemanding light. You sit down on the grass beside the bundle, your back against the willow's trunk, and you close your eyes, not to sleep, but simply to rest in the knowledge that everything you need is here, and the river continues its slow conversation with the bank as the morning eases into the next version of itself. You carry the bundle of withies down to the water's edge, leaving the trap where it leans against the willow, and the grass under your boots gives way first to the soft, dark mud of the bank, and then to the narrow strip of gravel and washed pebbles that the river has sorted and deposited over countless floods. The bundle is heavy across your 2 hands now, the twine bindings pressing into your palms through the wool of your mitts, and you walk with the slightly clumsy care of someone carrying something long and awkward that wants to roll and shift with every step. The mud sucks at your boots once, a soft wet sound that releases with a gentle squelch, and then you're on the gravel where the footing is more solid, the stones grinding against each other under your weight with a dry, clean sound like the turning of a mill wheel slowed to a crawl. You find the shallow pool you remembered from earlier, a small backwater formed where the current has curled around a fallen alder branch and scooped out a hollow in the riverbed, a hollow that is now full of still water, the color of weak tea, and you lower the bundle to the ground beside it, letting the withies rest on the stones while you straighten up and look at the pool to be sure it is right. The pool is perhaps the length of your arm across its widest point, and no deeper than your hand at the center. Its surface glassy and unbroken, except where a few small midges have dimpled it with their landing, and the water inside it is noticeably clearer than the river water, because the alder branch has created a tiny harbor where the silt has had time to settle out. You can see the bottom of the pool quite clearly, a mosaic of small flat pebbles in shades of grey and brown, and the occasional flash of white quartz, and among the pebbles lie a few sodden alder leaves that fell last week and have turned a translucent amber, their veins standing out like the lines on a very old palm. The pool is connected to the main river by a narrow channel where the water seeps in slowly, so slowly that the surface in the pool barely moves. And this is exactly what you need. A place where the withies can soak without being carried away by the current, where the water will soften the fibers gradually and evenly over the course of a day or a night. You kneel on the gravel beside the pool, feeling the small stones press into your knees through the thick wool of your breeches, and you untie the first twine loop from the bundle, the knot coming loose with a single tug on the loose end just as you tied it to do. And then the second loop, your fingers working without hurry because the morning is still young and the sky is still that soft, overcast white that makes time feel stretched and undemanding. The withies spring apart slightly as the bindings fall away, relaxing into a looser fan, and you lift the first rod from the pile and hold it in both hands, looking at it one more time before it goes into the water. The bark is smooth and cool, the color of pale green olives on one side and honey on the other, and you notice a tiny spiral mark near the tip, where a vine had wrapped itself around the shoot and left a shallow groove in the growing wood, a groove that is not deep enough to weaken the rod and will in fact give it an interesting texture when it is woven into the trap. You lower the rod into the pool, sliding it in gently at an angle so that the thick end touches the bottom first and the thin end follows, and the water closes over it with barely a ripple, the surface sealing itself back together as if the rod had always been there. You work through the bundle slowly, rod by rod, because there is no reason to rush and because the act of placing each withy in the water is a small satisfaction in itself. A quiet moment of transfer from air to water, from dry to wet, from the world of light and breeze to the world of shadow and stillness. Each rod you place makes a tiny disturbance on the pool's surface, a set of concentric rings that spread outward and fade into the edges, and then the surface returns to glass, and you add another rod and another until the bottom of the pool is lined with a neat grid of willow shoots, their tips all pointing towards the river and their thick ends nestled among the pebbles. Some of the rods have a slight natural curve, a memory of the direction they grew when they were reaching towards the sun, and these you place with the curve facing downward so that the water's weight will begin to straighten them, a slow persuasion that will take time, but will work if the wood is alive and willing. Others are perfectly straight and need no such arrangement, and they settle onto the bottom with a kind of quiet finality, as if they have been waiting to lie in water since the moment they were cut. When all the withies are in the pool, you sit back on your heels and look at them through the clear water, the rods slightly magnified and distorted by the surface, their colors deepened to a rich dark green and amber that will only intensify as the soaking continues. The water has already begun its work. You can see tiny bubbles forming along the cut ends of some of the thicker rods, air being drawn out of the wood fibers and replaced by water, a slow exchange that you cannot hurry, but can only wait for, and the waiting is itself a part of the work, as much a part as the cutting and the bundling and the weaving. You reach out and touch the surface of the pool with one finger, just to feel the coolness and to watch the dimples spread, and then you withdraw your hand and wipe it on your breeches and look around for a stone to weigh down the rods. The gravel bar that you are kneeling on provides many stones, and you pick through them with the same slow attention you have given everything else this morning, looking for one that is flat and heavy and smooth, a stone that will sit on top of the withies without damaging them and without rolling away when the river rises a little in the night. You find one near the waterline, a piece of grey sandstone about the size of your two hands placed together, its top and bottom surfaces worn perfectly flat by centuries of tumbling in the current, and one edge slightly rounded where the river has polished it to a soft curve. You lift it, feeling the weight and the cool grit of it against your palms, and you place it carefully in the center of the pool, lowering it slowly so that it does not splash or scare any small creature that might be hiding nearby, and it settles onto the withies with a soft clack that you feel through the water more than you hear, a sound that travels up through your hands and into the bones of your wrists. The stone sits squarely, its weight pressing the rods down into the water without crushing them, and you give it a gentle push with your thumb to test its stability, and it does not move, and so you leave it there and stand up, brushing the gravel dust from your knees and feeling the stretch in your back that comes from kneeling on hard ground. Now there is nothing to do but wait. You step back from the pool and find a dry patch of grass higher up the bank, a spot where the turf is thick and springy and not too cold, and you sit down with your back against a low tussock that cushions your spine and lets you look out over the river without having to crane your neck. The Severn in front of you is the same river it was an hour ago and a year ago, moving at the same deliberate pace, carrying the same brown-grey water from the hills to the sea. And you let your eyes rest on its surface as your breathing slows and the small tensions of the morning begin to drain out of your shoulders and into the ground. The river does not demand anything from you. It simply flows, and you simply watch, and the arrangement seems fair. The surface of the river is a moving map of the wind and the current. Near the far bank, where the water is deepest, the current draws long, smooth lines that look like the grain in a piece of polished wood. Lines that shift and reform endlessly without ever quite repeating themselves. Closer to your side, in the shallows where the water slides over a bed of small pebbles, the surface breaks into tiny riffles that catch the pale light and sparkle for a moment before smoothing out again. A pattern of light and shadow that is never still and never hurried. In the very center of the river, where the main flow runs strongest, you can see the water piling up against a submerged rock and then pouring over it in a glossy hump that creates a small standing wave, a wave that never moves forward but stays exactly where it is, a permanent feature of the river that you have known since you were a boy, and you watch it now with the same mild curiosity you always feel, wondering how old the rock is and how long the wave has been standing there. Leaves drift past at intervals, falling from the willows and alders that line both banks, and each one follows its own path down the river. Some leaves fall on the near side and are caught immediately by the slower inshore current, drifting in lazy circles close to the bank, where they bump against the reed stems and spin and then float free again, their progress measured in inches per minute. Other leaves fall further out and are seized by the main current, which carries them off downstream at a brisk walking pace, the leaves turning and dipping as they go, sometimes flipping over entirely to show their pale undersides before righting themselves and continuing on. You watch one particular leaf, a large yellow willow leaf that has fallen near the far bank, and you follow its journey with your eyes as it drifts across the river, its shape a bright speck against the grey-brown water, and it travels perhaps 50 yards downstream before it disappears around the bend, where the river curves behind a stand of alders. And then it is gone, and you do not wonder where it goes because you already know it will join the others in the slow eddy by the fallen ash, piling up in a wet golden mat that will eventually sink and become for the fervour of death bathing. The sky remains that even, flat white that seems to hold the day in suspension, neither brightening nor darkening, and the lack of shifting light makes the passage of time feel very strange, as if the morning has stretched itself into a long single moment that has no edges. You have no way to know how long you sit there because you're not counting, but after a while you become aware of a slight change in the air, a faint coolness that moves across your face from left to right, and you recognize it as the beginning of a breeze that has traveled down the river valley from the north. The breeze ruffles the surface of the water, breaking up the smooth grain of the current into a million tiny wavelets that scatter the pale skylight into 1,000 points of silver, and the sound of the river changes too, becoming a little louder as the wavelets slap against the bank and the reed stems. The breeze reaches the alder branch that shelters your pool, and the branch shifts slightly, its submerged twigs stirring up a small cloud of silt that spreads and fades, and the surface of the pool ripples once, a single long crease that travels from one side to the other and then vanishes. You look at the pool and see that the withies are still there under their stone, their shapes clear and solid in the shallow water, and nothing has disturbed them. A small water beetle has found its way into the pool, a tiny black oval no bigger than a lentil that rows itself across the surface with quick jerking movements of its legs, and you watch it travel from one edge of the pool to the other, its progress leaving a faint trail in the surface film, and then it climbs out onto the gravel and disappears between two pebbles. The beetle's visit reminds you that the pool is not just a workshop for your trap, but a whole small world that will continue to be itself long after you have taken the withies away, and you feel a quiet respect for that, a respect that has no words attached to it, but sits in your chest like a smooth stone. A flicker of silver catches your eye, the first fish you have seen today, and you turn your head slowly, not wanting to startle anything, until you are looking at the deeper water near the fallen alder branch. The fish is a dace, A small slim fish with a sharp nose and a body the color of polished tin, and it hangs in the water just below the surface, its fins moving in tiny rapid pulses that keep it perfectly still against the current. You watch it for a while, and then it darts sideways and vanishes into the shadow of the branch, and the water where it was is empty again, just the same grey-brown current flowing past without any sign that a fish had ever been there. A little later another fish rises, this one further out and closer to the far bank, and all you see is a single ring of ripples that spreads and fades and leaves the surface unmarked. The fish themselves are not important. What matters is the slow rhythm of their appearing and disappearing, a rhythm that matches the rhythm of the leaves and the breeze and the long, slow pulse of the river. The air smells different now, carrying a faint tang of mud from the shallows where the breeze has exposed a strip of riverbed that was underwater an hour ago. And underneath the mud smell, there is the clean mineral scent of wet stone and the green scent of crushed waterweed. You breathe it all in slowly, letting the smells settle in the back of your throat like a taste, and you feel the skin of your face tighten slightly as the breeze dries the dampness that the mist left there at dawn. Your hands are resting on your thighs, your palms turned upward, and you notice how pale they look against the dark wool of your breeches, the skin creased and calloused and still carrying a faint green stain from the willow sap you handled during the cutting. You turn one hand over and look at the lines on your palm, the lines that have deepened over years of working with rope and withy and knife, and you trace one of them with your thumb, a slow, absent gesture that you do not really think about. Time passes, and you do not measure it. The breeze dies back as quietly as it came, and the river returns to its smooth grain, and the leaves continue their slow drift downstream. You think about the trap waiting under the willow, about the splits you found in the withies this morning, about the new rods soaking in the pool and how they will feel when you take them out later, flexible and heavy with water, ready to be bent and woven and trimmed. You think about these things in a loose, drifting way, not planning or calculating, but simply holding them in your mind, the way the pool holds the withies, letting them rest there without forcing anything. The afternoon is somewhere ahead of you, and after the afternoon, the evening, and after the evening, the night when you will set the mended trap in the current and wait for the eels. But all that is still far away, as distant as the hills where the Severn begins. And right now, there is only this patch of grass, and this view of the river, and the quiet knowledge that the withies are soaking, and the day is moving forward at its own unhurried pace. A heron flies over the river, its wings beating in a slow, heavy rhythm that seems too deliberate to keep such a large bird in the air, and you watch it pass from right to left, its long legs trailing behind it and its neck folded back into its shoulders. It lets out a single rough call, a sound like a stick being drawn across a fence, and then it banks slightly and disappears behind the willows, and the sky is empty again, a smooth white sheet that holds no other birds. You follow the line of the willows with your eyes, the drooping branches that trail in the water and sway slightly even though there is no breeze now, swaying perhaps from the memory of the breeze or from the gentle pull of the current on their submerged tips. And you notice that some of the lower leaves have begun to turn color, their green fading to a pale yellow that will deepen to gold in another week or two. Autumn is not here yet, but it is coming. You can feel it in the slight sharpness of the air when the sun goes behind the thin clouds, and the eels can feel it too, which is why they are rising from the mud and starting their long journey downstream to the sea. You shift your position on the grass, stretching your legs out in front of you and crossing your ankles, and the movement makes a small rustling sound that is immediately swallowed by the larger quiet. The grass around you is dotted with tiny white flowers that you do not know the name of. Flowers so small that you have to look closely to see their petals, and a single bee hums among them, moving from flower to flower with a busy concentration that seems out of place in the stillness of the riverbank. You watch the bee work, its body dusted with pollen, its legs heavy with tiny yellow sacs that it will carry back to its hive somewhere in the hollow of an old ash. And you feel a distant kinship with the bee, a sense that you are both doing your small autumn tasks, tasks that have been done in this same way for longer than anyone can remember. Tasks that do not need to be explained or justified because they are simply what the season asks for. The pool in front of you has settled completely now, its surface so still that it reflects the sky with perfect fidelity, a pale white disk of water that looks like a hole in the ground opening onto a second, paler sky. The withies under the stone are invisible from this angle, but you know they are there, their fibers slowly drinking in the river water and becoming heavier and more supple, and the knowing is enough. You do not need to check on them or adjust them or do anything at all. You just need to be here, on this bank, in this pale morning, while the river does its work and the day does its turning. The quiet is so deep now that you can hear the blood moving in your own ears. A soft, distant rushing that sounds like the sea, and you close your eyes for a moment and let the sound carry you into a place that is not quite sleep, and not quite waking. A place where the river and the sky and the grass and the stone and the withies all blend together into a single steady hum. A hum that will continue for as long as the world continues, which is a very long time and no time at all. The afternoon has arrived without announcement, slipping into the river valley as quietly as the mist slipped out fit at dawn, and you find yourself walking back to the willow, where the trap still leans with its mouth open to the branches. The sky remains that same soft lid of high white cloud, unchanged in color and brightness, so that if you had been sleeping and someone had asked you what time of day it was, you would have had no answer except that it was day and not night. The grass under your feet is drier now than it was this morning. The dew long since lifted into the air, and the mud at the edge of the bank has begun to form a thin crust on its surface, a crust that cracks very slightly under your weight and then holds. You have left the bundle of withies soaking in the pool with the grey sandstone sitting on top of them, and you have left the river flowing past them, and you have left the small water beetle and the dace and the heron to their own slow business. And now you are ready to begin the mending that you have been thinking about all morning without quite thinking about it directly. The mending that has been waiting for you since you first picked up the trap before dawn and felt the splits and the loose bindings with your waking fingers. You reach the willow and crouch down beside the trap, placing one hand on the hazel hoop at its mouth to steady it, and the wood is dry and warm against your palm, having rested in the shade all morning and absorbed some small measure of heat from the air. The trap is exactly as you left it, which is no surprise but is still quietly satisfying, and you lift it with both hands and carry it back to the patch of flattened grass that serves as your workplace, the same patch you knelt on in the mist, the same patch your father knelt on and his father before him. You set the trap down across your lap as you sit, the wide mouth to your left and the narrow funnel end to your right, and the weight of it is familiar and grounding, a solid presence that tells your body it is time to work. From the leather bag you take out the small iron knife, unfolding the blade and checking its edge against your thumbnail, a habit you've had for so long that you do not remember learning it, and the edge is still sharp from the last wetting, catching the light in a thin silver line that vanishes when you turn the blade. The old bindings at the mouth of the trap are the first things that need your attention. These bindings are made of hemp twine that was once the color of dried hay, but has darkened over the seasons to a deep brown, almost black, and the creases where water and river slime have worked their way into the fibers, and in some places the twine has become so stiff and brittle that you can feel it crackle when you press it with your thumb. You locate the end of the first binding, a short tail of twine that was tucked under the wrap to keep it from unraveling, and you work the tip of the knife under it, wiggling the blade very gently from side to side until the tail lifts free and you can grip it between your finger and thumb. The twine feels rough and slightly gritty, coated with a fine silt that has dried to a grey powder, and when you pull on it, the first loop loosens with a tiny snapping sound, the sound of fibers that have been holding tight for a year finally letting go. You work the binding loose slowly, unwinding it turn by turn because there is no rush, and because the willow bark that the twine wraps around is delicate in places where it is worn thin, and you do not want to break anything that is still sound. Each loop of the old twine comes away with a slight resistance, a brief hesitation, as if the binding is reluctant to leave the shape it has been holding for so long, and then it falls free, and you pull it through, and lay it on the grass beside you, where a small pile of old twine is beginning to form. The pile is a messy coil of dark fibers that still hold the memory of the spiral they were wrapped in, and you notice that some pieces are so far gone that they crumble between your fingers when you pick them up, turning to a dry brown dust that scatters on the grass. These pieces you will not keep. The longer pieces that still have some strength left you will save, because even old twine has its uses, for tying up bundles of kindling, or for marking a line in the garden, or for mending a sack that does not need to be strong. When the first binding is fully removed, you can see the bare willow bark underneath. The spiral groove that the twine pressed into it over many soakings and dryings, a groove that is slightly paler than the rest of the bark because it was protected from the sun and the silt. You run your thumb along the groove, feeling the smooth, shallow indentation, and you are pleased to find that the bark is still firm beneath it, not rotted or split, which means the mouth hoop itself is still strong and will not need replacing this year. The hazel hoop is the foundation that everything else is built on, a circle of thick brown wood that you cut from a coppiced hazel stool 5 autumns ago, and bent into shape while it was still green, tying it with a temporary jig until it dried into a perfect ring. And you have a quiet affection for this hoop that is too mild to be called pride, but is something close to it. The feeling you have for a tool that has served well and asked for nothing in return. You move on to the second binding, which wraps around the junction where the mouth hoop meets the first upright stake, a place that takes a lot of strain when the trap is being lifted from the water with a heavy catch inside. This binding has fared worse than the first. The twine has frayed along its outer edge where it rubbed against stones and gravel, and the individual strands have separated and puffed out like the ends of a very old rope. You pick at the frayed fibers with the tip of the knife, teasing them apart, and the whole binding begins to loosen as the tension that held it together is released. A few strands snap, making a sound like tiny twigs breaking, and then the rest of the binding comes away in your hand, a tangled mat of fiber that you drop onto the pile beside you. The stake underneath is sound, a good thick hazel rod that is darkened with age, but shows no cracks or soft spots, though the lashing that held it to the hoop has left a faint impression in the wood that will make it easy to position the new binding accurately. The third binding is smaller, a narrow wrap that secures the point where 2 withies cross each other near the middle of the trap's belly. This one has not rotted, but has simply stretched with repeated wetting and drying until it no longer holds tight, and when you touch it with the tip of the knife, the whole loop slides sideways along the withies without any resistance at all. You pull it off with your fingers, a loose dark ring that you drop onto the pile, and you test the withies that it was holding together by pressing them gently in opposite directions. They move apart easily, opening a gap that a determined eel could push through, and you make a mental note that this crossing will need a fresh wrapping of twine pulled much tighter than the old one. The fourth binding is down near the bottom of the trap's belly, where the withies begin to taper sharply towards the funnel mouth, and this one has been chewed. You can see the tiny parallel grooves of rodent teeth in the twine, probably a water vole that found the trap when you last pulled it up onto the bank and left it to dry, and the chewing has gone deep enough to sever 2 of the 3 strands that made up the twine. The remaining strand is thin and white and stretches like a hair when you touch it, then snaps with no sound at all. You hold the chewed piece up to the pale light and examine the tooth marks, the neat little channels that the vole's incisors left behind, and you feel no anger towards the vole, only a mild curiosity about where it is now and whether it found a better meal elsewhere. You drop the chewed twine onto the pile and brush the vole's dried droppings from the weave, tiny dark pellets that crumble to dust between your fingers and join the earth of the riverbank. The 5th and 6th bindings come away easily, both of them still reasonably sound, but you are replacing them anyway because it is better to replace all the bindings at once than to leave one that might fail in the middle of the eel run. The 7th, however, puts up a fight. It is a thick wrapping of tarred twine that you renewed only last spring, and the tar has hardened into a black resin that glues the whole thing together into a solid lump, a lump that resists the point of your knife and turns the blade aside. You have to work at it carefully, chipping away at the tar in small flakes that fall onto your lap like black snow, and underneath the tar the twine is still strong and sound, the fibers still yellow and springy where they have been protected from the river water. You consider leaving this binding in place, because it is clearly still doing its job, but something in you wants the satisfaction of a complete renewal, every old piece replaced with new. So you continue chipping until you can slip the knife under the twine and cut it free. The binding comes off in 2 pieces, each one still holding its curve, and you set them aside on the grass because they are too good to throw away and might serve as a pattern when you cut the new pieces. By the time you have worked your way along the whole length of the trap, the pile of old twine beside you has grown into a small dark nest, and the trap on your lap looks different than it did an hour ago. Looser and more open, as if it has exhaled a breath it had been holding since last autumn. The upright stakes still hold their shape because they are woven into the structure of the belly, but without the bindings there is a new flexibility to the whole thing, a slight give when you press on it that was not there before, and the gaps between the withies are more visible now, the light coming through them in thin, pale lines that trace the outline of each missing or damaged piece. You run your hand along the full length of the trap, from the wide mouth hoop to the tightly bound point at the narrow end, and your fingers catalogue the work that remains. 2 split withies to be replaced, 1 loose stake to be relashed to the mouth hoop, the funnel tips to be real-angled, and the new bindings to be wrapped at every junction that you have just uncovered. The list is longer than you remembered, but not longer than you can manage, and you feel a quiet readiness that is not eagerness, but something more solid, the readiness of a person who knows exactly what needs doing and has the tools to do it. You lay the trap gently on the grass and stand up, stretching your arms above your head and feeling the muscles in your back pull and then release, the pleasant ache of having been bent over work for a long time. The river is still there in front of you, still the same grey-brown sheet moving patiently towards the sea, and the pale sky is still there above it, and the willows on the far bank are still dipping their branches in the water, and nothing has changed except that the pile of old twine on the grass has grown, and the trap has grown looser, and the day has moved forward by an amount that you cannot measure, but can feel in the slight change of the light, which has shifted from the flat white of midday to a slightly warmer tone, a hint of pale in the slight change that had with us beforehand. You gather the old twine from the pile, sorting it roughly into 2 bundles as you do. The pieces that are too brittle and rotten to be any use, which you will add to the firewood, and the longer pieces that still have some life in them, which you coil into a loose loop and tuck into the leather bag for later. The rotten pieces you carry a few steps away from your work spot and drop onto a flat stone where the sun, if it ever comes out from behind the cloud, will dry them completely and make them easy to burn. The good pieces you wind around your fingers into a small tight coil, the kind of coil that will fit in the palm of your hand, and you push it into the bottom of the leather bag where it will not tangle with the other tools. The old tarred twine you leave on the grass for now, because it is sticky and will make a mess of the bag, and you tell yourself you will remember to pick it up later, a small promise that you will probably keep, because you always do. Now you kneel again beside the trap and begin the slower, more careful work of unpicking the broken withies that need to be removed before the new ones can be woven in. This is more delicate than removing the bindings because the withies are woven into the fabric of the trap, and you cannot simply cut them free without disturbing the surrounding weave. So you use the tip of the knife to tease apart the crossings, lifting each overlapping strand slightly and sliding the broken piece out from underneath. A puzzle that your fingers understand without needing your mind to direct them. The first broken withy comes out with a soft scraping sound, its split halves parting company completely as it leaves the weave, and you hold it up to the light and look at it one last time before setting it aside. It is a piece of 3-year-old willow, dark and weathered, and the split runs along the grain in a clean straight line that suggests it was a frost crack. The water in the wood freezing on a cold January night and expanding until the fibers parted. You set it on the firewood pile and go back to work. The second broken withy is harder to extract because it crosses under 3 other withies and over 2 more, and you have to work slowly, lifting each crossing strand with the knife blade and holding it up while you pull the broken piece through, then lowering the strand back into place. The weave complains with small creaking sounds, the sound of dry willow rubbing against dry willow, but nothing snaps and nothing splits. And after a few patient minutes, the broken withy slides free and you add it to the pile. The gap it leaves behind is roughly oval, framed by the sound withies that cross above and below it, and you can already see in your mind the shape of the new withy that will fill this gap. A shape that is currently soaking in the pool under the grey sandstone, getting heavier and more flexible with every passing hour. The loose stake that you noticed this morning is the last thing you attend to before the light changes. You wiggle it with your fingers and find that it has come loose, not because the wood is rotten, but because the notch where it fits into the mouth hoop has worn wide over many seasons of use. The constant pressure of the water and the weight of catches gradually enlarging the socket until it no longer grips. You could carve a new notch, but that would change the angle of the stake and might throw the whole shape of the trap out of true, so instead you decide that a thicker binding will do the job. A wrap of new twine that will fill the worn space and hold the stake firmly against the hoop. You test this idea by pressing the stake into its socket and holding it there with your thumb while you visualize the binding, and the idea feels sound. A simple solution that does not require making anything new or throwing anything away. The light has shifted again while you were working, the pale gold suggestion at the edge of the sky deepening by a small increment into something that is almost yellow, and you look up and see that the cloud cover has begun to thin in the west, just a little, just enough to let a wash of warmer light spread across the river valley. The water catches this light and turns from grey-brown to a soft bronze. The wavelets glinting with a richer color, and the leaves of the willows on the far bank are suddenly greener than they were, their yellowing edges picked out in bright detail. You stop working for a moment and simply look, because the river in late afternoon light is a different river than the one you have been watching all day, and it deserves to be seen properly. The heron is back, or another heron, standing motionless on a sandbar in the shallows, its grey feathers touched with a faint warmth, its reflection a perfect inverted copy that extends downward into the bronze water and then dissolves into the depths where the light cannot reach. You pick up the old tarred twine from the grass and add it to the leather bag, wrapping it in the scrap of linen to keep it from sticking to the other tools, and you fold the knife and put that in the bag too, and you pull the cord tight and set the bag aside. The trap lies on the grass in its loosened state, its bindings gone and its broken pieces removed, and it looks vulnerable in a way, like a half-finished thing that is neither the old trap it was this morning nor the new trap it will be tomorrow. But this vulnerability does not worry you, because it does not worry you, because it is a necessary part of the process, a middle stage that must be passed through on the way to wholeness. You lift the trap and carry it back to the willow, propping it carefully against the trunk with its mouth upward as before, and you pat it once with your hand, a small gesture that means nothing in particular, but feels like the right thing to do, and then you turn away and face the river, while the afternoon slides very slowly towards the first thoughts of evening. The new hazel hoops have been waiting for you in the bottom of the leather bag since you cut them 3 weeks ago. 2 thick rods that you harvested from the same coppice where you gathered the withies, and now you pull them out and lay them across the grass where the afternoon light, still flat and unchanging, falls on their brown bark with a soft, dull sheen. The hoops are nothing more than straight rods at the moment, each one about the length of your arm and the thickness of your thumb at the base, tapering slightly towards the tip, and you run one through your fingers to feel the smoothness of the bark and the slight grip of the tiny lenticels that dot its surface, small raised spots that let the living wood breathe when it was still attached to its stool. The hazel is different from willow in ways that matter for the work ahead. It is denser and heavier, its fibers tighter and less willing to bend, which makes it harder to shape, but better at holding that shape once the shaping is done, a quality that you need for the inner frames of the trap, where the constant pressure of the current and the weight of the catch would slowly deform a softer wood. You set the 2 new rods aside for a moment and turn your attention back to the trap, which lies on the grass in its loosened state, the bindings gone and the broken withies removed, looking more like a skeleton of a trap than the complete thing you carried down to the river before dawn. The inner frames are easy to find because they stand slightly proud of the weave, a series of 5 hazel hoops spaced evenly down the length of the trap's belly, each one threaded through the upright stakes and woven into the fabric of the withies to give the whole structure its conical shape. You start at the mouth end, where the largest hoop circles just inside the main hazel ring, and you take hold of it through a gap in the weave with your thumb and forefinger, wiggling it gently to see if it moves. It does not move, which is good, so you run your finger along its inner curve, feeling for any rough patches or cracks that might have developed over the season, but the wood is smooth and solid all the way around, its surface polished by the rubbing of many eels sliding past it on their way into the funnel, and you decide this hoop can stay. The second hoop is smaller, seated about a hand's length further down the trap where the cone begins to narrow, and as soon as you touch it, you know something is wrong. There is a flat spot on the curve that should not be there, a section where the hoop has straightened slightly, and when you press on it with your thumb, the wood flexes inward with a soft creaking sound and then stays flexed, not springing back as it ought to. You take hold of the hoop through the gaps in the weave and work it free from the withies, sliding it out inch by inch with a series of gentle, twisting motions that loosen its grip on the surrounding willow. And when it comes out into your hand, you can see the problem clearly. A crack runs halfway through the wood at the point where the flat spot was. A crack that follows the grain and then veers across it in a fine dark line that has begun to darken with rot. The first faint bloom of decay that would have spread if you had left it in place for another seconds. You put the damaged hoop on the grass beside you, a task done and a problem solved, and you move on to the third. The third hoop is sound, still perfectly round and still firmly embedded, and you leave it in place after testing it with the same careful pressure of your thumb. The fourth hoop is another matter entirely. You can see from the outside of the trap that something is not right with it, because the weave around it has buckled slightly, the withies pulling inward where the hoop has failed to support them, and when you reach inside and feel for the hoop you find it in two pieces, a clean break right through the middle of the rod where the grain must have been weak from the start. The two halves shift against each other when you touch them, a dry scraping sound that makes you wince a little at the thought of how long the trap has been carrying this broken frame without you knowing. You pull the pieces out one at a time, the break ends pale and fibrous where the wood parted, and you examine them closely to see if the break shows any sign of having happened gradually or all at once. Your curiosity slow and idle now that the damage is done. There is no way to tell, of course, so you simply add both pieces to the pile on the grass and dust your hands together to knock off the small wood fragments that cling to your fingers. The fifth and smallest hoop, down near the funnel throat, is perfectly fine, its diameter no larger than a hen's egg, and you leave it where it is with a quick touch to confirm its solidity. Now you have a trap with 3 good inner frames and 2 gaps where frames should be, and you pick up the first of the new hazel rods and hold it across your knee, feeling the spring of it, the way it resists being bent, but does not snap when you apply pressure, a resistance that tells you the wood is still alive enough to shape, but not so alive that it will try to straighten itself later when you need it to stay curved. Bending a hazel hoop is a slow process that you cannot rush, because if you bend it too quickly, the fibers will tear inside the bark and the rod will snap when you least expect it. Perhaps not today, but a week from now, when the trap is submerged in cold river water and the pressure of the current is working on it. You start by warming the rod with your hands, rubbing it up and down between your palms to generate a little heat from friction, a small warmth that you can feel spreading through the bark and into the wood beneath. And as you rub, you rotate the rod slowly so that every side gets equal attention. The motion is repetitive and soothing, your hands moving back and forth in a rhythm that matches the rhythm of your breathing, and after a few minutes the rod begins to feel different under your fingers, less rigid, more willing to yield. You place the rod across your right knee then, gripping the thick end with your left hand and the middle with your right, and you begin to apply pressure very slowly, pulling the ends towards each other while your knee acts as a fulcrum, pushing outward against the center of the rod. The rod bends into a shallow curve at first, a bow shape that is barely visible, and you hold it there for a long moment while the wood fibers adjust to their new position, a moment that stretches into half a minute and then a full minute while you sit completely still, your arms locked in position, your breathing shallow and steady. The hazel creaks softly, a tiny sound like a door opening very far away, and you feel a slight vibration run through the rod as a few fibers shift inside, but nothing cracks and nothing splinters, so you increase the pressure by another small degree, bending the rod a little more, holding it, waiting, breathing, bending again. The shape you are aiming for is an almost closed circle, a hoop that will fit inside the trap's belly, with its 2 ends overlapping by about 2 finger widths, and it takes perhaps a quarter of an hour to coax the rod into this shape, working by increments so small that each one seems like no progress at all until you look at the rod and see that it has become a U and then an O, and then something very close to a circle until you look at the rod and see that it has become a U and then an O, and then something pretty certain. Your hands ache mildly from the steady pressure, the muscles in your forearms warm and tired in a way that is not unpleasant. And when you finally bring the two ends past each other into an overlap, you let out a breath that you did not know you had been holding, a long, slow exhale that fades into the quiet afternoon air. The ends of the hoop now need to be trimmed and notched so that they will fit together cleanly and hold the circular shape without a binding, a joint that will stay closed by its own tension once it is pressed into place inside the trap. You unfold the knife and hold the hoop up to the pale sky light, squinting along its curve to see exactly where the overlap begins and ends, and then you make two careful cuts, one at the tip of each end, slicing at a shallow angle so that the cut surfaces will lie flat against each other when brought together. The knife goes through the hazel with more resistance than it gave to the willow this morning, the denser wood squeaking slightly against the blade, and the cut ends are pale and clean, showing the concentric rings of a rod that was 4 years old when you harvested it. You shave a small notch into each cut surface, a groove that will allow the ends to hook together slightly, a simple joint that you learned from your father when you were still clumsy with a knife, and cut your thumb more than once trying to make the notches too deep. The memory of those small cuts is distant now, the scars faded to thin white lines that you can barely see, but the lesson they taught you has stayed. The lesson that shallowness is strength when it comes to notches in hazel. With the ends trimmed and notched, you bring them together and test the fit, pressing the hoop into its final circular shape with steady pressure from both hands. And the ends seat against each other with a soft tap, the notches catching and holding, the hoop holding itself closed without any help from you. You turn it in your hands, examining the circle from every angle, and it is a good hoop, not perfectly round, but close enough that the difference will disappear once it is woven into the trap and held by the pressure of the surrounding withies. You set it aside on the grass and pick up the second rod, which will become the replacement for the fourth hoop, and you begin the whole process again, warming it between your palms, bending it across your knee, working the curve by slow degrees, trimming and notching the ends, testing the fit. By the time the second hoop is finished, the afternoon has moved into its final quarter and the light has begun to shift again, the pale gold that appeared earlier deepening into a warmer tone that you can feel on your skin as a gentle heat when you hold your face up to it. The cloud cover has thinned enough to let a few patches of blue show through in the west, ragged shapes that drift and change and then close again, and the river reflects these patches in a broken mosaic of darker and lighter grays, its surface still moving at the same steady pace but now carrying a hint of the evening that is still a few hours away, but coming as surely as the eels are coming up from the mud and beginning their slow migration towards the sea. You look at your two new hoops lying on the grass, their fresh pale cut ends bright against the darker bark of their outer curves, and you are satisfied in a quiet way that has no need for words. Now comes the careful work of fitting the new hoops into the trap. You pick up the first one, the larger of the two, and you bring it to the trap where it lies on your lap, positioning it over the open gap left by the old cracked hoop and comparing its size to the diameter of the trap at that point. The fit is close but not exact, the new hoop being just slightly larger than the space, which is what you intended, because a hoop that is too small will fall out and a hoop that is too large can be compressed slightly by the weave until it fits. The willow withies gripping it from all sides, like a hand closing around a handle. You compress the hoop now between your hands, squeezing it gently into a slight oval, and then you slide it into the trap through the wide mouth, pushing it down the belly with your fingers extended, feeling your way past the upright stakes and the crossing withies, until the hoop reaches its correct position and the pressure of the surrounding weave tells you it is home. The hoop settles into place with a soft series of clicks. As the withies adjust around it, each crossing strand finding its natural position against the new curve, and you work the hoop very slightly back and forth to help it seat fully, the hazel rubbing against the willow with a sound like very fine sandpaper drawn across wood. Once it is in place, you lean forward and look through the mouth of the trap to check that the hoop sits square to the long axis of the cone, not tilted or twisted, and the view confirms what your fingers already told you. The hoop is straight and true, its pale interior curve contrasting with the dark weathered inner surface of the trap's belly. You tap it once with your knuckle, a dull solid sound that means it is seated firmly, and then you move on to the second hoop. The second hoop is smaller and easier to maneuver, slipping down the trap's belly with very little resistance, and you guide it into the gap left by the hoop that snapped in two, using the tip of your little finger to nudge it past a protruding withy end and then pressing it home with the flat of your thumb. This one sits even more snugly than the first, its diameter just exactly matching the cone at that narrow point, and it makes a satisfying soft pop as it settles into its final position, the sound of a thing going where it belongs. You check it as you checked the first one, peering into the darkness of the trap through the wide mouth, and it is perfect, or perfect enough, a small pale ring that will do its job quietly for many seasons, holding the shape of the trap against the weight of water and eels and time. With the hoops in place, you gather the broken pieces from the grass, the cracked hoop with the flat spot and the two halves of the snapped one, and you hold them in your hand for a moment, feeling their different weights and textures. The cracked hoop is heavier than it looks, its wood dense from years of soaking and drying, and the broken pieces are almost weightless, their fibers dry and light, and you think about how these hoops have served well by breaking slowly, so that the track did not fail suddenly, giving you time to notice the damage and make the repair before the eel run began. You add them to the firewood pile on the flat stone, a pile that has grown now to include the old twine and the broken withies, and these two failed hoops, a small monument to the work of maintenance that is never really finished, only paused and then begun again. The trap on your lap feels different now that its inner frames are whole again, firmer and more resistant when you squeeze its sides, the new hoops transferring their strength into the weave and giving the whole structure a solidity that it was missing this morning. You turn it over in your hands, looking at it from all sides, and you can see how the weave has tightened around the new hoops, the withies pulling into a more regular alignment now that they have something to press against, the gaps between them closing, and the whole shape of the trap becoming more symmetrical. It is still not finished. There are still bindings to wrap and withies to replace, and the funnel mouth to re-angle, but the skeleton is whole now. The bones are good, and that is a significant thing, a turning point in the slow arc of the work. You lean back and rest your weight on your hands, your palms pressing into the cool grass, and you let your eyes wander over the river, while the small muscles in your fingers unknot themselves from the work of shaping and fitting. The Severn has not changed. It is still the same grey-brown sheet under the same high, pale sky, but something about the quality of the light has shifted again, a deepening of the gold that now hangs over the western end of the valley, like a curtain half drawn, catching the tips of the far willows and turning them to a colour that is almost orange. A few more birds have appeared, a pair of mallards dabbling in the shallows near the far bank, their tails up and their heads down, working the mud for snails and caddis larvae, and a single thrush calling from somewhere in the hedge with a song that repeats 3 notes over and over in a pattern that you almost recognize but cannot quite hold in your memory. The air has cooled by a small amount, just enough to remind you that the evening will be cool when it comes, and the smell of the river has shifted too, from the clean, wet stone smell of midday to something earthier and deeper. The smell of mud and leaf mold, and the slow decomposition that feeds the water and the things that live in it. You stand up and stretch, your spine unstacking vertebrae by vertebrae with a series of small pops that are satisfying without being dramatic, and you walk a few steps down to the water's edge where the mud is dark and soft and cool under your boots. The river at your feet is moving just a little faster than it was this morning, you notice. The riffle over the gravel bar a shade deeper and the sound a shade louder, and you wonder if there's been rain upstream somewhere. A brief shower in the hills that is now making its way down to the sea in the form of a slight rise in the current. It will not affect the trap, you decide. The rise is too small to shift the stone you will use to weight it, but it is good to notice these things, good to keep a catalogue of the river's moods in the back of your mind where it will be available when you need it. You turn back to your workplace and gather up the trap and the knife and the leather bag, piling them together at the base of the willow, and you lay the 2 new hoops that you shaped alongside them, though there is nothing left to do with the hoops now that they are seated. The day's work is not over, but the hardest part of it is done, the part that required strength and patience and a slow coaxing of unwilling wood into unnatural curves, and what remains is the weaving, the rhythmic over and under, of soaked withies being threaded through the warp of upright stakes, a task that is more like braiding hair than like wrestling with hazel. You will come to that tomorrow, or perhaps later tonight if you feel wakeful, But for now you simply stand beside the willow and watch the river turn gold in the fading afternoon, its surface a moving mirror that holds the sky and the trees in the shape of you, standing on the bank, a shape that is small against the wide water and the wide sky and the wide quiet of the valley, a shape that is content to be small and quiet and still. The morning comes again, or perhaps it is the same morning stretched across 2 days, because the sky when you step out onto the riverbank has that same high pale lid of cloud that you walked under yesterday, the same soft white light that casts no shadows and makes the hours feel like a single long moment without seams. You have fetched the bundle of withies from the pool where they have been soaking all night under the grey sandstone, and now you carry them back to your work spot with both hands, the bundle dripping a trail of dark spots onto the grass, the rods heavy and cool and dark with the water they have absorbed. The withies have changed in the soaking. Their bark, which was pale green and honey when you cut them, has deepened to colours you would name as umber and dark olive, and the brown of very old leather. And when you press your thumb into one of the thicker rods, the wood yields slightly, a soft give that tells you the fibres are full of river water and ready to bend without cracking. You lower the bundle onto the grass beside the trap, untying the twine that held it together during the night, and the withies spread apart like the ribs of a fan, each one separate and distinct, glistening with moisture in the flat morning light. The trap lies where you left it, propped against the willow with its mouth open, and you lift it now and bring it back to your lap, turning it so that the gaps left by the broken withies face upward, where you can see them clearly. The holes look different today than they did yesterday, not more urgent, but somehow more personal, as if they have been waiting patiently all night for you to return and finish what you started, and you feel a quiet pull towards them, the same pull you always feel when a half-done task sits in front of you, asking to be made whole. You run your fingers over the edges of the first gap, feeling the smooth ends of the surrounding withies where you trimmed them yesterday, and then you turn to the bundle and begin selecting the rods you will weave in. The first withy you choose is a medium rod, slightly thinner than your little finger, with a straight grain and no visible knots or twists. You lift it from the bundle, water dripping from its tip in a slow silver chain that makes a pattering sound on the grass, and you bend it gently between your hands to test its flexibility, feeling it arc into a smooth curve without any of the resistance that dry willow would give. It is as supple as a length of rope, ready to be worked through the warp of the trap's belly, and you lay it across your lap while you examine the gap one more time, tracing the path that the new withy will follow over this stake and under that one and over the next and under the last. A simple pattern that your hands know so well they could do it in the dark. Weaving is a rhythm more than it is a skill, a slow back and forth that requires patience, but very little thought once you've settled into it. You feed the thick end of the new withy into the gap, sliding it under the first crossing strand, and the wet willow moves easily through the space, its slick bark slipping against the dry old withies with a soft whispering sound that is almost too quiet to hear. You pull it through until only a short tail remains sticking out beyond the edge of the gap, a tail that you will trim later, once the whole length is in place. And then you begin working the withy over and under, following the randing pattern that the trap was built on 20 years ago, and that every repair since has followed, a pattern as old as baskets and as old as fishing. Each time the withy passes under a crossing strand, you have to lift the strand slightly with your thumb, just enough to make room, and each time it passes over you press it down gently to keep the weave tight. A small rocking motion of your hands that repeats and repeats until it becomes automatic. Something your body does while your mind drifts out across the river and rests on the moving water. The new withy settles into place with a series of tiny adjustments, each over and under shifting it by a fraction of an inch until it lies perfectly parallel with its neighbours, the gap closing gradually as you work your way from one side to the other. The wet willow glistens against the dry, its darker colour making a stark contrast that will fade over the coming weeks as the new withies age and weather and become indistinguishable from the old, a slow blending that the river and the sun will do for free and without being asked. When you reach the far side of the gap, you have a second tail, shorter than the first, sticking out beyond the weave, and you leave it there for now, moving on to the next gap without pausing to admire your work. though a part of you does admire it, quietly, in a corner of your mind that doesn't need words. The second gap is narrower and longer. A thin oval that will take a thinner withy. So you select a rod from the bundle that is about the thickness of a goose quill, its bark smooth and dark and its tip tapering to a fine point that is almost translucent when you hold it up to the light. This withy is so flexible that it droops under its own weight when you pick it up, the waterlogged tip bending downward like a wilted stem, and you have to support it with both hands as you feed it into the gap, threading the narrow end through first because the thick end would catch on the crossing strands and refuse to go. The thin withy weaves in more quickly than the first, its slimness allowing it to slip through the tight spaces without any need to lift the surrounding strands, and you work it back and forth in a swift, gentle rhythm that reminds you of darning a sock, the same over and under, the same slight tug at the end of each pass to keep the tension even. The gap closes up under your hands, the new withy filling it like water filling a footprint in the mud, and when it is done the weave in that spot looks whole again. A continuous surface of crossing lines that an eye that didn't know where to look would never find a patch in. You pause for a moment and flex your fingers, which have begun to stiffen from the steady pressure of gripping and threading, and you look out over the river while the small muscles in your hands unknot themselves. The Severn is the same as it was, the same grey-brown sheet moving at the same patient pace. But the light has shifted slightly, the flat white of early morning giving way to a brighter white that has a touch of warmth in it, the warmth of a sun that is somewhere above the clouds but cannot quite break through. The mallards are back, or a different pair of mallards, dabbling near the far bank with their tails pointed at the sky, and a single black cormorant flies low over the water, its wingtips almost touching the surface, moving downstream with a purpose that you do not share. You watch the cormorant until it disappears around the bend, and then you turn back to the trap and the bundle of withies and the work that is waiting. The third gap is the largest of them all, the one left by the broken withy that had split all the way through and had to be cut out in two pieces, and it is a wide oblong that spans nearly a hand's length of the trap's belly. This will take a thicker withy, perhaps the thickest rod in the bundle, and you find it near the bottom of the pile. A sturdy rod, the thickness of your thumb at its base, tapering very slowly over its full length until it ends in a tip no wider than a darning needle. You pull it out and wipe the excess water from its surface with your palm, the water beading and falling away, and you test its flexibility by bending it against your knee, feeling the solid resistance of a rod that has soaked for a full day and night and is now as pliable as it will ever be. The bend is smooth and unbroken, the inner curve of the bark compressing without any crackling sound, and you are satisfied that it will do. Weaving a thick rod into a tight gap requires more patience than weaving a thin one, because the thick rod does not want to bend sharply enough to make the tight turns at the edges of the weave, and you have to coax it around each corner slowly, applying pressure with your thumb in small increments while your other hand holds the rod steady, guiding it like a horse through a narrow gate. The sound it makes as it slides against the crossing withies is louder than before, a soft creak that rises and falls with each pass, the sound of wet willow rubbing against dry willow, and the smell of the river rises up from the rod as you work it, a clean, muddy scent that mixes with the greener smell of the crushed willow fibers that are very slowly abrading from the surface of the rod. You work your way across the gap pass by pass, over and under, and the gap shrinks from an oblong to a crescent to a thin line, to nothing, the thick new withy nestling into place among its older neighbours and becoming part of the fabric of the trap. When you have woven in all the replacement withies, the trap's belly is whole again, a continuous surface of crossing lines that runs from the wide mouth all the way down to the narrow throat where the funnel begins. You run your palm over the new weave, feeling the slight unevenness where the fresh withies are still round and full of water, while the old ones have dried to a flatter, more angular profile, an unevenness that will disappear after the first few soakings in the river when the new withies dry and shrink and take on the same shape as the old. The trap feels solid now, its weave tight and regular, and the gaps that worried you yesterday are gone, replaced by rows of dark wet willow that gleam in the pale morning light, like the skin of a healthy eel. You lift the trap and turn it over in your hands, checking the work from all sides, a slow inspection that is not driven by anxiety, but by a calm thoroughness that is its own kind of satisfaction. On the underside you find a small gap that you had not noticed before, a narrow slit between two old withies that has opened up since yesterday, probably because the removal of the broken rods shifted the tension in the weave. It is small enough that you could leave it, and it would probably hold, but something in you cannot leave a gap that you have seen, so you pick through the bundle for one last withy, a short, slender rod that is almost a scrap, and you weave it into the slit with a few quick passes, filling the space in less than a minute. Now the trap is as whole as your hands and your materials can make it, and you set it down on the grass and lean back, stretching your spine and letting the quiet satisfaction of completion wash over you, like the slow water washing over the gravel bar at the edge of the river. The morning has moved on around you while you wove, the sun climbing higher behind the clouds, and the air warming by a few small degrees, enough that you notice the difference on the skin of your face and the backs of your hands. You pull off your wool mitts, which you have worn all through the work without thinking about them, and you tuck them into the waist of your breeches, enjoying the feel of the cool air on your bare fingers. The fingers are stained dark from the wet willow, patches of umber and brown that look almost like bruises, but wash off easily with river water and a bit of sand, and you rub them together absent-mindedly, feeling the slight grittiness of the willow tannin that has dried on your skin, a fine powder that smells faintly of tea. The bundle of withies is much reduced now, only a handful of thin rods remaining, too short or too slender for the belly weave, but perfect for the delicate work of the funnel mouth that still waits for you at the narrow end of the trap. You gather these remaining withies and tie them back into a small bundle with the same twine you used before, looping it around the middle and pulling it tight with a quick tug, and you set them aside in the shade of the willow where they will stay moist and workable for the rest of the day. The offcuts and trimmings from the weaving, the short tails you left sticking out beyond the edges of the gaps, you trim now with the small iron knife, cutting each one flush with the weave, and letting the scraps fall onto the grass, where they join the growing pile of firewood that you will carry home at the end of the work. Each cut is a small, precise action, the blade sliding through the wet willow with almost no resistance, and the pieces that fall away are a mix of old dark wood and new pale wood, their cut ends bright and green, smelling, releasing a scent that reminds you of spring coppicing, of standing in the osier bed with the rain on your neck and the knife in your hand, a memory that is distant but pleasant, like a faint echo of a song you used to know. You gather the trimmings and add them to the firewood pile, which has grown large enough now that it will make a good fire when you eventually light it, a fire that will burn hot and fast because willow is not a long-burning wood, its flame bright yellow and its smoke pale grey, a fire more for company than for warmth on a night that is cool but not cold. The trap is finished except for the funnel mouth and the final bindings, and you hold it up in front of you at arm's length, looking at it against the pale sky, a long tapering cone of woven willow that is both old and new, both the trap your father made and the trap you are remaking, a thing that has passed through years and hands and seasons to be here now on this bank in this light. The new withies gleam, the old ones glow with the soft patina of age, and the hoops inside hold the shape true, a shape that is functional and graceful in the way that useful things often are, a shape that needs no decoration because its purpose is its beauty. You lower the trap back to your lap and your hands rest on it lightly, your palms cupping its curve, and you feel the quiet rightness of a thing well made, a feeling that is so familiar and so deep that it has no name but is simply the background hum of your life, as constant and as quiet as the river. The narrow end of the trap waits for you now, the funnel mouth that you inspected yesterday morning in the mist and found wanting, two of its slender willow tips bent backwards by the thrashing of a large eel, and two more worn blunt by a season of rubbing against gravel, and you turn the trap on your lap so that the funnel points towards the sky, its small dark opening looking up the pale clouds like a tiny throat waiting to be fed. The funnel is the most delicate part of the whole trap, a cone of inward-pointing willow tips arranged in a tight circle around a central opening that must be wide enough to let an eel slide through, but narrow enough that the eel cannot find its way back out. And the making of it requires a different kind of attention than the weaving of the belly, a finer attention, slower and more precise, the kind of attention you might use to thread a needle in poor light. You lean closer to the funnel, bringing your face near enough that you can smell the faint sourness of old river slime that still clings to the deepest crevices, and you begin the slow work of sorting the damaged tips from the sound ones, a catalogue that your fingers make by touch as much as by sight. The damaged tips are easy to find because they catch on your thumb when you run it around the inner circle of the funnel, their bent ends snagging the skin with a slight scratch, and the blunt ones feel different too, their points rounded and soft instead of sharp and firm. You isolate the first bent tip with your finger, pressing it gently outward from the center until it separates from its neighbors, and you can see now that the bend is not a simple kink, but a full fold. The willow fibers crushed at a point about a thumb's length from the tip, crushed so thoroughly that the inner wood is visible through a split in the bark, pale and dry and dead. This tip cannot be straightened, as you knew yesterday, and so you take the knife and make a cut at its base, slicing where the tip joins the last ring of the belly weave, a cut that is angled to match the slant of the funnel so that the replacement will sit at the same pitch. The damaged tip comes away in your hand, a thin sliver of dark wood that is almost weightless, and you set it on the grass with the other scraps, a small addition to the firewood pile. The second bent tip is worse. It's folded so tight that the two halves of the willow lie flat against each other like a closed book, and you have to work the knife blade under the fold to pry it apart enough to make the cut, a delicate operation that you perform with your breath held and your hand steadied against your knee. The knife slips once, but only a little, and the blade slides along the bark without cutting it, leaving a pale scratch that will fade as the willow darkens, and then you have the tip free, a crooked little thing that looks more like a twig than a trap part, and you add it to the pile and move on. The two blunt tips are easier to deal with because they are still straight, just worn down, and you cut them out with quick, precise strokes, leaving 4 empty spaces in the circle of the funnel that will need new tips to fill them. The bundle of remaining withies is where you left it, a small tied clutch of thin rods in the shade of the willow, still wet and flexible from their long soaking, and you untie the twine and spread them on the grass, looking for 4 that are exactly suited to the work of the funnel. The funnel tips must be long and very slender, tapering to a point that is fine enough to guide an eel, but not so fine that it will snap under the pressure of a fish pushing against it, and they must be straight, or nearly straight, with a natural spring that will keep them pointing inward even after many soakings and dryings. You pick through the remaining withies one by one, holding each up to the sky and sighting along its length the way you might sight along a fishing rod to check its straightness. And you select 4 that are close to perfect, their tips needle sharp and their bases thick enough to seat firmly in the weave, and you lay these 4 in a row on the grass beside the trap, all of them pointing the same direction, their wet bark gleaming in the high, pale light. Now comes the careful work of pointing the new tips, because even the best natural withy tip can be improved with a few strokes of the knife, the end shaved into a taper that is smooth and gradual and perfectly round, a taper that will guide an eel's nose into the opening without any sharp edges to catch on the skin. You take the first of the 4 withies and hold it up close to your face, turning it slowly between your fingers to see the curve of its tip, and you begin to shave it with a knife, drawing the blade along the wood in short, gentle strokes that remove the thinnest possible shavings, each one curling away from the edge like a tiny wood-colored ribbon and falling onto your lap. The sound of the knife on the wet willow is a soft whisper, barely there, and the smell of the fresh-cut wood is green and clean, mixing with the older smells of river mud and damp wool that cling to your clothes after 2 days on the bank. You work your way down the first tip, rotating it constantly to keep the taper even on all sides, and when you are satisfied you test it by pressing the point against the ball of your thumb, feeling for sharpness without any roughness, a smooth sharpness that will let the tip slide past an eel's scales without catching. The second tip takes longer because it has a slight natural curve near the end, a curve that you have to work around, shaving more from the outer side and less from the inner to bring the point back to center, a subtle adjustment that your hands know how to make even though your mind could not explain it in words. The third tip is almost perfect, straight from the bundle, needing only a few light strokes to refine its point, and the fourth is similar, its tip already fine and its bark smooth, and when all 4 are done, you lay them back on the grass and flex your fingers, which have tightened into a grip around the knife handle without you noticing. Fitting the new tips into the funnel is the most demanding part of the whole mending, because each tip must be seated at exactly the right angle, pointing inward towards the center of the opening at a slant that matches its neighbors, a slant that has been worked out over many generations of trap makers and is not written down anywhere but lives in the memory of hands. You pick up the first new tip in the trap, and you slide the thick end of the tip into the empty space left by one of the bent tips, pushing it down into the weave until it reaches the last hoop inside the trap, the small hazel ring that you checked yesterday and found to be sound, and you press it firmly against the hoop to anchor it while you adjust the angle. The new tip sticks out of the weave at a slightly wrong angle at first, too upright, pointing too directly towards the center, and you have to wiggle it gently from side to side, loosening the grip of the weave just enough to tilt it outward by a degree so small that nobody would notice it unless they were looking for it. But the eels will notice, the eels will feel the difference between a funnel that guides them smoothly inward and a funnel that blocks their path with a tip that is too steep. You sight along the funnel from the outside, closing one eye and looking at the circle of tips to see if the new one lines up with the old ones, and it is close but not exact. So you adjust it again, a tiny push with your thumb that shifts the angle by a hair, and now it is right, now it is right, now it matches, and you let the weave close around the base of the tip and hold it there. The second tip goes in more quickly, your fingers having remembered the feel of the right angle from the first one, and the third goes in faster still, the motion becoming a rhythm, like the weaving was a rhythm. A series of small actions that flow one into the next without any gap between them where thinking might get in the way. The fourth tip gives you trouble because the empty space it must fill is slightly narrower than the others, the old withies on either side having shifted inward over time, and you have to compress the base of the new tip between your fingers to make it slim enough to fit, the wet willow squeezing into a slightly oval shape that will round out again once it dries, and then you work it into the gap with patient pressure, rocking it back and forth in tiny increments until it slides home and sits flush with its neighbors, its aim beef at the exact same With all four new tips in place, the funnel is whole again, a tight circle of slender willow points all aimed towards the center like a trap, made of tiny spears or like the iris of an eye closing around a pupil, and you test the opening by pushing 3 fingers together and sliding them through the funnel from the wide end, a measurement that your father taught you when you were so young that you had to use 2 fingers instead of 3 because your hand was still small. The 3 fingers pass through with a slight resistance, the tips brushing against your knuckles with a soft scratching feeling. Just enough resistance to tell you that an eel of keepable size will have to squeeze a little, but not so much that it will turn away. A balance that is the whole art of the funnel, the difference between a trap that the eels swim past. You withdraw your fingers and look at the opening from the outside, a small dark hole surrounded by a starburst of willow tips, and you nod to yourself. A tiny movement that nobody sees, but that means the funnel is right. Now you turn your attention to the tips that are still sound but need to be tucked. The older tips that have been in place for several seasons and have begun to work loose at their bases, their points still sharp but their anchorage weakened by the constant pressure of eels pushing past them year after year. You go around the circle of the funnel with your thumb, pressing on each tip near its base to test its firmness, and you find 3 that move slightly when you press. A small wobble that would probably not matter, but that you will fix anyway because you are here, and the knife is sharp, and there is time. Tucking a loose tip is simpler than replacing one. You pare a tiny sliver of willow from the edge of the weave beside the tip, a shaving so thin it is almost transparent, and then you press the tip deeper into the weave and wedge the sliver in beside it, tapping it gently with the flat of the knife blade until it sits firm. A small wooden shim that tightens the whole fit and will hold until the willow itself grows into the new space and makes the shim unnecessary. You work around the funnel slowly, paring and wedging and tapping. At each loose tip you tighten makes the whole funnel feel more solid under your hand, the circle of points becoming a single unified structure rather than a collection of individual tips. The tapping of the knife blade against the willow shims makes a soft ticking sound that carries a little way along the bank before it fades into the larger sounds of the river and the wind and the distant birds, a small domestic sound that belongs to workshops and firesides and the quiet corners of human industry. When the last tip is tucked, you run your thumb around the funnel one final time, and feel no wobble anywhere, just a firm, even ring of points that are ready to guide the eels into the belly of the trap. And you set the knife down on the grass and rest your hands on the curve of the trap with a feeling that is as close to contentment as anything you know. The funnel mouth reminds you of the trap your father made, the one that hung in the workshop when you were a boy. A trap that was older than you, and older than your father too, made by your grandfather in a winter that nobody alive now can remember. That trap had a funnel that was almost identical to this one, the same number of tips, the same inward angle, the same three-finger opening at the throat, and you remember staring at it as a child while your father worked, tracing the shape of it with your eyes and wondering how anyone could make something so neat, so regular, so perfectly suited to its purpose. Now your hands make the same shape without your mind having to guide them, and the thought of that is strange and comforting at the same time. A feeling of being part of a long line of hands that have all shaped willow into funnels and set them in the Severn while the autumn eels ran, a line that stretches back into a past so deep that nobody remembers its beginning and will stretch forward into a future that you will not see but can imagine, dimly, as you imagine the river flowing past the bank after you have gone. You lift the trap and hold it up to the sky again, looking through the funnel from the wide end, and the circle of tips frames a small disk of pale cloud that blazes white against the dark interior of the belly. A little window into the world that the eels will swim through in the dark of the night, seeking the bait that you will place inside. A paste of crushed lamprey and river moss that will draw them in and hold them in. The view through the funnel is oddly beautiful, a thing you notice every year and then forget until the next year when you notice it again, and you hold the trap there for a moment longer than you need to, letting the image settle into your memory alongside all the other images of this day and this river and this season of the year. When you lower the trap back to your lap, the light has moved on, the high white of midday softening into the first pale gold of afternoon, and the river has taken on a slightly different color, a hint of warmer brown that comes from the angle of the sun catching the silt suspended in the water. The work is not finished. There are still the new bindings to wrap around every junction you uncovered yesterday, a long, slow task of winding twine and pulling it tight that will take another hour or perhaps two, but the trap is shaped now, its skeleton whole and its skin woven and its throat waiting. And that is enough for this moment, enough to let you sit on the grass with the trap across your knees and the river moving past, and the pale sky holding its steady light over the whole valley, a light that state notes that you bear day when you set the mended trap aside against the willow and straighten your back, feeling the long afternoon of work settle into your shoulders as a dull warmth that is not quite an ache. And you turn to face the river just as the light begins its slow change from afternoon into something softer. The first hint of dusk creeping into the valley like water seeping into sand. The sky has finally begun to break apart after a full day of holding its pale lid over the world, and in the west the clouds have thinned to a wash of the palest gold, a color that has no name beyond the feeling it gives you, which is the feeling of a day completing itself without any rush or protest. The river catches this new light on its surface, and the grey-brown of the afternoon deepens into a color closer to bronze, a moving bronze that shifts and slides as the current draws its endless lines from bank to bank, and you find a dry patch of grass a little way back from the water's edge where you can sit and watch without needing to do anything else at all. You sit with your legs stretched out in front of you and your hands resting on your thighs, palms turned up in a way that has become a habit. And you let your breathing slow until it matches the rhythm of the river, a rhythm that is too slow to count but steady enough to feel, a deep and ancient pulse that has been beating in this valley since before there was anyone here to name it. The air is cool now, but not cold, carrying the first sharpness of autumn that will deepen as the night comes on, and it smells of wet mud and waterweed and the faint, clean tang of the stones along the shore. A smell that you have known for so long that it has become the background of your life. A smell that means home more than any roof or hearth ever could. You close your eyes for a moment and simply listen, and the world resolves itself into a pattern of small sounds that each arrive and then fade and then are replaced by others. A pattern that has no beginning and no end. The sedge on your right rustles with the movement of something small, a reed warbler perhaps, or a water vole moving through the stems. its passage marked by a dry whisper of leaves rubbing together that rises and then falls silent. And a moment later, you hear the soft plop of a frog jumping into the shallows, a sound that is more water than frog, a single liquid note that vanishes as soon as it appears. Further out on the river, a fish rises, and the ring of its rise spreads outward in a perfect circle that catches the gold light for a moment and then smooths away into the general flow. And somewhere far off towards the bend, where the alders stand, a curlew calls, its long bubbling note carrying across the water with a clarity that makes it seem closer than it is. A sound that is the sound of autumn evenings and mudflats and the turning of the year. You open your eyes and the curlew calls again, a single long note that hangs in the air and then curls downward at the end like a leaf falling, and you feel something in you uncurl slightly, a small tension you had not noticed releasing itself into the quiet. The river is still empty of any obvious movement except the endless movement of the water itself, but you know that under the surface things are changing, that in the deep pools and the muddy backwaters the eels are beginning to stir, feeling the ancient signal that tells them it is time to rise from their summer hiding places and begin the long journey downstream to the sea. You have seen this rising every autumn of your adult life, and for many autumns before that, when you were a boy and your father let you stay up late to watch, and the watching never becomes old because the eels are never the same. Each year's runs slightly different in its timing and its numbers, and the way the eels move through the water, though always the same in its deep and patient purpose, that has been unfolding in this river since the river first cut its channel through the valley. You settle your gaze on the surface of the water where the light is fading, and you wait, because waiting is the only thing the eels ask of you. The first sign is so small that you almost miss it, a slight disturbance near the far bank where the current runs deep and dark, a shadow that moves against the current when everything else is moving with it, a shape that is too long and too thin to be a fish of the ordinary kind. You lean forward very slightly, your eyes narrowing as they try to make sense of what they are seeing, and then the shape resolves itself into the unmistakable ribbon of an eel, a dark, undulating length of muscle and purpose that moves upstream with a sinuous, writhing motion, its body describing a series of slow S-curves that push against the water and drive it forward, always forward towards the headwaters where it was born and towards the sea, where it will spawn and die. The eel is perhaps the length of your arm, its back a dark olive brown that blends perfectly with the peaty water, and its belly, when it rolls slightly to avoid a submerged branch, is the palest gold, a flash of color that catches the dusk light and then is gone, swallowed back into the depths. You watch this first eel until it disappears into the shadow of the far bank, and then your eyes search the water for more, scanning the surface with the slow, methodical attention of someone who has done this many times and knows that the eels do not come all at once, but in a long, gradual stream that will last through the night and into the next day and the day after that. Another eel appears closer to your side of the river, moving along the edge of the reed bed where the water is shallower and the current weaker, and this one is smaller, perhaps the length of your hand and your forearm together, its body a thinner ribbon that seems almost fragile as it navigates the stems of the reeds, slipping between them with a liquid ease that makes it look more like water than like flesh. The eel pauses for a moment, its head raised slightly as if testing the current or the scent of the water, and then it resumes its journey, its body resuming those slow S-curves that carry it upstream with a motion that is both graceful and oddly deliberate, as if it knows exactly where it is going and has known since the moment it hatched from an egg somewhere in the deep Sargasso Sea, a place you have never seen and never will see, but can imagine as a vast expanse of floating weed and blue water, a place that Ian Ding. A third eel appears further out in the main current, and this one is larger, a thick, dark shape that moves with a powerful writhing motion, its passage marked by a series of small swirls on the surface, the water being pushed aside by the force of its body and then rushing back to fill the space it has left behind. You can see the ripples of its movement spreading outward in a V shape that points upstream, a living arrow that tells you exactly where the eel is, even when its body has dived deeper into the brown water and become invisible. And you follow the progress of those ripples with your eyes as they travel upriver, past the fallen alder, and past the sandbar and past the place where the heron stood yesterday, until they fade into the general twilight and are lost among the shadows that are now beginning to gather on the water. The light is draining from the sky in a slow, steady seep, the pale gold in the west, deepening to amber and then to a soft rose that tints the undersides of the few clouds that still hang there. And the river catches these colors and holds them for a moment on its moving surface before they slide downstream and are replaced by new colors, darker colors, the indigo and gray of the coming night. The sounds of the valley are changing too, the daytime birds falling silent one by one, and the night birds beginning to stir, and you hear the soft hoot of an owl somewhere in the woods behind the far bank, a single low note that is repeated after a long pause, and then after another long pause. A call that seems to be asking a question that nobody will answer. The sedge rustles again with the movement of something that might be a moorhen settling down for the night, and the reeds whisper to each other in a language that is made entirely of small frictions, leaf against leaf, stem against stem, a dry, papery sound that is the background music of the riverbank after dark. More eels are coming now. A steady procession of dark ribbons that move against the current with that same slow writhing motion, their bodies appearing and disappearing in the fading light until the water seems to be alive with them, though you know that what you are seeing is only a small fraction of the total number, that for every eel visible near the surface there are 10 more traveling deeper down where the water is, darker, and the current stronger. You watch them with a quiet wonder that never diminishes, no matter how many times you see it. A wonder at the sheer persistence of these creatures, their journey of thousands of miles from the Sargasso to the Severn and now back again. A journey that will take them past weirs and mills and the nets of fishermen, past herons and otters and all the other dangers that a slow dark river can hold. A journey that most of them will not survive, and yet they make it anyway, driven by something so deep that it has no language to bail it. A splash breaks the surface near the far bank, a sudden sharp sound that makes you turn your head, and you see the rings of a disturbance spreading outward from a point where an eel has broken the surface completely, its body a dark flash against the bronze water, and then it is gone, diving back down into the depths, with a flick of its tail that leaves only the fading rings and the memory of the movement it made. A moment later, another splash, this one smaller and closer, and then another further downstream, and the river seems to be full of these small eruptions, the sounds of eels moving through the upper layers of the water as they navigate the shallows on their way upstream, a series of soft plops and splashes that punctuate the steady murmur of the current like notes in a melody that has no tune but still feels like music. You sit and listen to the splashes and watch the dark shapes moving under the water, and the sense of time passing very slowly returns. The same feeling you had this morning when the mist was lifting and the day was still new. A feeling that the ordinary measures of hours and minutes have been suspended and replaced by something older and slower. The time of the river, and the eels, and the turning of the earth under the fading sky. The air grows cooler still, and you pull your cloak a little tighter around your shoulders, feeling the rough wool against your neck and the weight of it settling across your back. A weight that is comforting in the way that familiar things are comforting. A small anchor that holds you in place while the world moves around you. A rustle in the sedge behind you makes you turn, and you see a dark shape moving along the edge of the reeds, a shape that is too large to be a water vole and too low to the ground to be a heron. And after a moment, you recognize it as an otter. A sleek brown animal that moves with a fluid grace, its body sliding through the shallows with barely a ripple, its head low and its tail behind it like a living rope. The otter pauses when it senses your presence, its nose lifting to test the air, and you sit very still, not wanting to disturb it. And after a long moment it decides you are not a threat and continues on its way, slipping into the deeper water and disappearing with a soft swirl. A hunter among the eels that is as old as the eels themselves, part of the same ancient pattern of the river, the same slow turning of life and death and life, again that has been going on in this valley since the ice melted and that the water began to love the weka to them light. The last light is fading now, the rose and amber in the west giving way to a deep violet that is almost grey, and the river is losing its colour, the bronze and gold of dusk draining away into a flat silver that will soon become the black of night, a black that is not truly black, but a deep shifting darkness, full of hidden movements and small reflections, the darkness of a river at eel time, when the world above the water goes quiet and the world below the water comes alive. The first stars are beginning to appear in the east, Small pale points of light that flicker very slightly as if they are not quite sure they should be there yet. And you find the star that you always look for, the bright one that hangs just above the line of the far hills, and you watch it for a while as it strengthens from a faint glimmer to a steady white point. A companion in the growing dark, the curlew calls again, further away now, its bubbling note drifting across the river from somewhere down towards the estuary where the mudflats spread out under the falling night, and the sound is so lonely and so beautiful that it catches in your chest for a moment. A small ache that is not sadness but something close to it, something to do with the passing of time and the beauty of things that will not last. You let the sound fade into the darkness, and then you let it go, returning your attention to the river and the eels, which are still moving past in their steady, silent stream. Dark shapes that are now barely visible against the dark water, their presence betrayed only by the occasional swirl or splash, the tiny disturbances of the surface that tell you they are still there. Still coming, still answering the call that has called them since before there were people on the earth to watch them go. You realize that you have been sitting here for a long time, perhaps an hour or perhaps more, and the thought does not trouble you because there is nowhere else you need to be, and nothing else you need to do, only this bank and this river and this slow procession of eels that will continue through the night while you sleep, and through the next day while you work, and through all the days of the run until the last eel has passed, and the river grows quiet again for the winter. You stand up slowly, your legs stiff from sitting on the cool grass, and you walk the few steps to the water's edge, peering into the darkness where the shallow water laps against the mud, and you can just make out the shape of a small eel working its way along the shoreline, its body a thin, pale ribbon against the dark stones, and you watch it until it finds its way into the deeper current and vanishes. Another traveler on a journey you will never fully understand, but can witness, and witnessing is enough, has always been enough. The lantern is where you left it, a small tin box with a horn window that hangs from a hook on the willow, and you take it down now and set it on the grass, working the flint and steel with the slow practiced motions of someone who has done this in the dark more times than he can count. The spark catches the wick on the third strike, a small yellow flame that wavers and then steadies, and the light pushes back the twilight, just enough to make a small warm circle on the grass around you, a circle that contains the lantern and the trap, and your hands, and the tools you have laid out in a row. Beyond the circle the world has gone to deep blues and greys, the river a sheet of moving darkness that reflects the lantern flame in a long thin line that stretches across the water and disappears into the far bank, and the sky above is a darker blue still. The last pale wash of dusk fading in the west, and the first true stars beginning to show in the east. The air is properly cool now, the kind of cool that makes you glad of your wool cloak and your mitts, and your breath comes out in small clouds that drift through the lantern light and dissolve into the darkness on the other side. You open the leather bag and take out the small clay pot that holds the bait paste, a pot you prepared yesterday before you walk down to the river, its lid pressed on tight and sealed with a smear of beeswax to keep the smell from attracting every cat and fox between the cottage and the bank. The pot is cool in your hand, the clay rough and unglazed, and when you break the wax seal and lift the lid, the smell of the paste rises up in the lantern light. A rich dark smell that is part fish and part earth and part something sharper that you cannot name, a smell that is not pleasant exactly, but is deeply familiar. The smell of autumn and eel runs and the work you have done every year since you were old enough to help your father mix the paste in the same clay pot, on the same workbench by the same clay pot, on in the same work but haste the paste yes the colour of the river mud at the pulatamite, still moist from the river water you mixed into it yesterday. A mixture of crushed lamprey that you caught in the spring and dried on racks, ground to a coarse powder between two flat stones, and then combined with river moss scraped for the stones of the ford and boiled into thick jelly. The whole thing stirred together with a little water, from the same poo where the paste sicketed together centre the cinter it's to vicket, etc. and the set. You set the pot on the grass beside the trap and take up a small flat stick that you use as a spatula, a piece of willow that has been worn smooth by many years of this same task. It's end-shaped into a blunt curve that fits perfectly into the curve of the trap's belly, and you dip it into the paste and scoop out a dollop about the size of a walnut, the paste clinging to the wood with a soft sucking sound as you lift it out. The lantern light catches the surface of the paste and makes it gleam slightly, a wet sheen that moves as you turn the stick and you lean forward and reach into the wide mouth of the trap, your arm disappearing into the darkness of the interior until your fingers touch the far end near the funnel, and you begin to spread the paste along the inner surface, working the stick back and forth in slow, smooth strokes that lay the paste onto the withies in a thin, even layer. The smell of the paste intensifies as you work it, filling the small circle of lantern light with its dark richness, and you breathe it in without thinking, a smell that is as much a part of the season as the turning leaves and the cooling air and the eels themselves. You spread the paste along the full length of the trap's belly, working from the funnel end back towards the mouth, coating the inner withies with a layer that is thick enough to hold its scent for a full night of soaking in the current, but thin enough that it will not clog the gaps between the withies and prevent the water from flowing through. A balance you have learned by doing and cannot explain but can feel when it is right. When the paste is spread to your satisfaction, you withdraw your arm and set the stick aside, wiping your fingers on the grass to clean off the residue, and you look into the mouth of the trap to check the work, the lantern light throwing a faint glow into the interior that shows the paste as a darker shadow against the paler willow, a shadow that covers the whole inner surface in a continuous layer. No bare spots and no thick clumps, just a smooth, even coating that will do its work silently through the night. You put the lid back on the clay pot and press it down firmly, sealing the remaining paste for another night, for the trap will need to be baited again tomorrow and the next night and every night of the eel run until the catch begins to thin and you know the main body of the migration has passed, a period of perhaps a week or perhaps depending on the weather and the moon and the temperature of the water, factors that you track without writing them down, holding them in the back of your mind alongside the other seasonal rhythms that shape the year. The pot goes back into the leather bag, and you take out the length of thicker cord that will serve as the trapline, a rope of hemp that you twisted yourself in the winter evenings, its fibers tight and even and dark with age, strong enough to hold against the pull of the current and the weight of a trap full of eels. You tie one end of the line to the reinforced binding at the narrow end of the trap, the knot, a simple one that will hold under strain but can be undone with a single pull when you need to empty the trap, and you test it with a sharp tug, feeling the line go tight and the trap jerk towards you, and the knot holds as you knew it would. Now you need a stone to weight the trap, a flat, heavy stone that will hold it on the riverbed against the current, and you walk down to the gravel bar with the lantern in one hand, the small circle of light moving with you and revealing the stones at your feet, each one glistening faintly with the moisture of the evening dew. You search among the stones with the same slow attention you have given everything else, looking for one that is flat enough to sit snugly against the curve of the trap's belly and heavy enough to hold it down, but not so heavy that you cannot carry it out into the river without losing your footing, a balance that is as important as the balance of the paste or the balance of the funnel opening, a balance that your feet and your hands understand, even if your mind does not. You find a stone near the waterline, a piece of dark grey slate about the size of a loaf of bread, its top and bottom surfaces parallel and smooth, its edges worn round by the river, and you lift it and feel its weight, a solid heft that will do the job perfectly. You carry it back to the trap and set it on the grass beside the lantern, and then you take a short length of twine from the bag and tie the stone to the underside of the trap, lashing it firmly against the belly with 3 loops that pull the stone tight against the withies, the twine passing through the gaps in the weave and around the central hoop, a fixing that will hold the stone in place but can be cut easily when you need to remove it for mending or for transport. The trap is ready now, baited and weighted and tied to its line, and you stand up and stretch your back, looking out over the dark river where the eels are still moving upstream in their slow, silent procession, their passage marked by the occasional splash or swirl that catches the starlight for a moment and then fades. The night is fully dark now, the last color gone from the sky and replaced by a deep black that is full of stars, more stars than you can count, a thick dusting of light that stretches from horizon to horizon, and the river reflects these stars in a scattered pattern that shifts and rearranges itself with the movement of the water, a second sky flowing under the first, just as bright and just as deep. You take the lantern and walk along the bank to the place where the current curls behind the fallen alder, a spot you chose yesterday when you were planning this moment, without consciously planning it. A spot where the water slows and deepens and the eels like to rest on their journey upstream, pausing in the slack water before they push on through the faster current. The alder branch still lies where it fell 3 winters ago, its bark long since stripped away by the water, its bare wood smooth and pale, and it creates a small backwater behind it, a quiet place where the current eddies gently and the silt has built up into a soft bed that will hold the trap without letting it shift. You set the lantern on the bank at the edge of this spot, its light falling on the water and turning the surface into a shifting amber glow, and you sit down on the grass to remove your boots and your stockings, the cool air touching your bare feet with a sharpness that makes you shiver once, a quick tremor that runs up your legs and then is gone. The grass is cold and damp under your soles, and you stand up carefully, feeling the small stones and roots pressing into your skin, and you pick up the trap with both hands, the weight of the stone pulling it down, the line coiled loosely over your arm, and you take your first step into the river. The water is colder than you expected, the autumn chill having settled into it over the past weeks, and it grips your ankles with a cold that is almost a burn, a sharp sensation that makes you catch your breath and then release it slowly, deliberately, letting your body adjust to the temperature, as it always does, the blood retreating from your skin and the deeper warmth of your core holding steady. You stand there for a moment, the water flowing around your feet and tugging at the hem of your rolled-up breeches, and you feel the riverbed under your soles, the smooth mud, and the occasional pebble and the fine grit that shifts with your weight, a texture that is as familiar as the texture of the grass or the texture of the willow in your hands. The current here at the edge is slow, barely a push against your shins, but you know it will grow stronger as you walk out towards the alder branch and you move slowly, testing each step before you commit your weight, your bare feet reading the riverbed like a blind person reads a face. The water rises to your knees as you move further out, the cold intensifying and then steadying into a deep chill that is no longer shocking but simply present, a condition of the world that you accept because you must, because the trap must be set and the eels must be caught, and this is how it has always been done. The current pushes against your legs with a gentle but insistent pressure, the water swirling around your calves and creating small eddies that tug at the fabric of your breeches, and you can feel the force of the whole river behind that pressure, the weight of all the water that has come down from the hills and is now making its way to the sea. A force that could knock you over if you let it, but you will not let it, because you know how to stand, how to lean into the current at the right angle, how to place your feet flat on the riverbed and let the water row brilliantly. You reach the slack water behind the alder branch and stop, the current here suddenly quieter, the pressure against your legs dropping away until the water feels almost still, just a gentle circular movement that eddies around the fallen trunk and returns on itself, a slow spiral that carries small flecks of foam and the occasional drifting leaf. The water here is deeper, up to your thighs, and the cold is more insistent but still bearable, a steady chill that you can manage for as long as you need to, which is not long because the task is simple and your hands know what to do. You lower the trap into the water with both hands, feeling the stone weight pull it downward, and you guide it to the riverbed, placing it on the soft silt where it will sit firmly, its mouth facing downstream into the slack water, its funnel pointing upstream towards the current, an arrangement that will let the eels follow the scent of the paste and swim into the wide mouth and then through the funnel into the belly, where they will find themselves unable to turn around and swim out again, held by the inward-pointing tips that you repaired this afternoon. The trap settles onto the riverbed with a soft thump that you feel through your hands rather than hear, and you hold it there for a moment while you check that it is level and stable, your fingers tracing the curve of the mouth hoop and the line of the stone, feeling for any tilt or wobble that might allow the current to shift it during the night. The trap sits well, the stone holding it down and the silt cradling its belly, and you release it slowly, keeping your hands near in case it moves. But it does not move. It stays where you placed it, a dark shape just visible under the amber lantern light that reaches into the water, a shape that will become invisible as soon as you withdraw the lantern, hidden in the black water where the eels will find it by smell alone. You pay out the line as you back away from the trap, walking slowly backwards through the water, the line running through your fingers with a slight rasping sound. And when you reach the bank, you fasten the free end to the root of the willow that leans over the water, tying it with a knot that will hold against any pull but can be undone with one hand when you come to lift the trap in the morning. The knot is the same knot your father taught you. The same knot his father taught him, a simple loop with a slip that tightens under load and loosens with a flick of the wrist. A knot that has fastened trap lines to willow roots on this bank for more years than anyone can remember. You give the line a gentle pull and feel the trap resist at the other end, a solid weight that tells you it is still in place and still secure, and then you let the line go slack and stand up straight, your feet on the grass again, the cold water dripping from your legs and soaking into the turf. You pick up the lantern from the bank and hold it out over the water, looking for the trap. But the lantern light only penetrates a short way into the brown water, a few inches at most, and the trap is already invisible, hidden in the darkness that has swallowed it completely. And that is as it should be, the trap doing its work unseen. A silent partner in the long relationship between the river and the people who live beside it. You set the lantern down on the grass and dry your feet and legs with a handful of soft sedge, the leaves absorbing the river water and leaving your skin cool but no longer dripping. And you pull your stockings and boots back on, the wool warm against your chilled skin, the leather stiff and familiar, and you stamp your feet once on the grass to settle them, a small drumbeat that the river swallows without comment. The trap is set, the bait is spreading its scent into the current, and the eels are moving in the darkness, and all that remains is to wait, to sit on the bank through the long night and let the river do what the river does, which is flow, always flow, carrying everything with it towards the sea. You build a fire before you do anything else, because the fire is the center of the long night ahead, the small warm heart that will hold the darkness at bay while you sit on the bank and wait for the eels to find the trap. You walk back along the grass to the flat stone, where you've been piling the scraps all day, the broken withies and the old twine and the shattered hoops and the trimmings from the weaving, a small mountain of dry willow that has been drying in the pale sun and is now ready to burn. And you gather it in your arms along with a handful of dry sedge for tinder, carrying the whole rustling bundle back to the patch of grass near the willow where you have decided to sit out the night. The spot is a good one, slightly raised above the mud, with a clear view of the place where the trap line enters the water, and a natural hollow in the turf that will shelter the fire from the breeze that often gets up in the small hours before dawn. And you kneel down and arrange the fire carefully, the way you arrange everything carefully, laying the tinder in a loose nest and building a small teepee of the driest twigs over it, the larger pieces laid to one side where they can catch once the flames are established. The flint and steel are still in your hand from lighting the lantern, and you strike them now over the tinder, the sparks showering down into the dry sedge in a brief bright rain that catches and holds, a tiny orange glow that spreads outward into the grass and then into the twigs, the flames licking up through the structure, with a soft crackling sound that is the most welcome sound you have heard all day. The fire takes hold quickly, willow being a wood that catches easily and burns fast. The flames are bright yellow that pushes back the circle of darkness and throws a warm light onto the grass and the willow trunk and the edge of the water and your own face and hands, a light that dances and shifts with the movement of the flames and makes the shadows around you seem to breathe. You sit back on your heels and watch the fire establish itself, adding a few of the larger pieces from the pile, and the flames grow taller and steadier, the heat reaching your face and hands and chasing away the chill that has been settling into your skin since you waded out of the river, a warmth that is deeply pleasant and deeply simple. The oldest comfort in the world. You settle yourself on the grass with your back against the willow trunk, the bark rough and solid behind your shoulders, and you draw your wool cloak around you, pulling it tight across your chest and tucking the edges under your thighs to keep out the cold that will creep in from the sides as the night deepens. The cloak is old and heavy, woven from the wool of sheep that grazed the water meadow above the coppice, and it smells of wood smoke and lanolin and the faint mustiness of long storage, a smell that is the smell of winter evenings and the work of the colder months, the time when the eels are gone and the trap hangs in the workshop and the river runs high and fast with the rains. You pull the hood up over your head and it frames your face, blocking the peripheral darkness and focusing your attention on the small circle of firelight and the stretch of river just beyond it, the line where the light meets the water and stops, a boundary between the known and the unknown that you will watch through the night. The lantern you set beside you on the grass, its flame turned down low so that it will burn for many hours without needing more oil, a small point of steadier light that complements the shifting light of the fire, and the two lights together make a warm island in the vast dark of the river valley, an island that contains you and the willow and the trapline and the small pile of remaining firewood, an island that contains you and the willow and the trapline and the small pile of remaining firewood, an island that managing to slat but rement sikkelbithe flaint the efferetisk.